There is a place where you have been dwelling, though you may not have known its name. It is the chrysalis of your own making, not the biological cocoon of the butterfly, but the psychological womb of the unawakened soul. Here, in this space, between worlds, you have wrapped yourself in the silken threads of what others expected you to be, layer upon layer, until the original you became invisible even to your own eyes. In this protected darkness, you learned to breathe through the filtered air of approval. You learned to see through the narrow windows that society carved for you. You learned to walk in the footsteps already pressed into the earth by countless others who, like you, forgot that they had the power to create their own path. This is not failure. This is the necessary first stage of all profound transformation. The seed must first be buried in darkness before it can reach toward light. But beneath the carefully woven threads of your persona, beneath the gleaming armor of your acceptable self, something stirs. It has always been stirring, even when you could not feel it, even when the noise of the world drowned out its whisper. This something is your authentic self, not the self that smiles when it wants to scream, not the self that says yes when it means no, not the self that has learned to make itself small, to fit into spaces, never meant to contain its vastness. The persona you wear is a masterpiece of adaptation. Look at how perfectly it reflects back what each person needs to see. To your family, you are the dutiful daughter or devoted mother. To your colleagues, you are the competent professional who never lets emotion interfere with productivity. To your friends, you are the supportive listener who always has time for their crises but rarely speaks of your own. To society, you are the acceptable woman who colors within the lines and never asks why the lines exist at all. This persona is not evil. It is a necessary development of the psyche, as Jung understood. It is the mask we learn to wear to navigate the social world, to find our place in the collective. But what begins as a helpful adaptation can become a prison when we forget it is merely a mask. What starts as protection can become suffocation when we lose touch with the face beneath the covering. In the slumbering chrysalis of unconscious living, you have learned to interpret every inner stirring through the lens of external validation, that flutter of dissatisfaction when you wake each morning. You tell yourself it's ingratitude. After all, you have everything you're supposed to want. That ache when you look in the mirror and see a stranger staring back, you dismiss it as vanity or the inevitable march of time. That voice that whispers in the quiet moments that there must be more than this. You silence it with busy work, with endless obligations, with the familiar comfort of staying exactly where you are. But the soul is persistent. It speaks in symptoms when it cannot speak in words. It manifests in the body when the mind refuses to listen. It creates crises when gentle promptings are ignored. You may notice that your sleep has become restless, filled with dreams you cannot quite remember, but that leave you feeling homesick for a place you have never been. You may find yourself crying at unexpected moments, during a movie, while reading a book, when a piece of music touches something deep within you that has been sleeping. These are not signs of breakdown, they are signs of breakthrough attempting to occur. The soul is preparing for emergence, and like any birth, it begins with the tightening of the space that once felt comfortable. The chrysalis that once protected now constrains. The identity that once provided security now feels like a lie you can no longer sustain. In this liminal space between who you have been and who you are becoming, you may experience what Jung called the transcendent function, that mysterious process by which opposites within the psyche begin to unite and create something entirely new. You feel pulled simultaneously toward safety and risk, toward conformity and rebellion, toward the familiar and the unknown. This tension is not something to resolve quickly or escape from. It is the very engine of transformation. The slumbering chrysalis is also a place of profound unconsciousness, where you live not your own life, but the unlived life of your ancestors, your culture, your collective conditioning. You carry within your psyche the unexpressed dreams of your grandmother, the unspoken rebellions of your great-grandmother, the silenced voices of countless women who bent themselves into acceptable shapes and passed down the pattern like a genetic inheritance. This is what Jung meant by the collective unconscious, that deeper layer of the psyche that contains not just your personal history, but the archetypal patterns of all humanity. In your slumber, you have been living out ancient scripts, written long before your birth. The script of the self-sacrificing mother, the accommodating wife, the woman who lives for others and forgets she has a self worth living for. But even these archetypal patterns carry their own medicine. Within the archetype of the self-sacrificing woman lies the seed of the Great Mother, the nourishing force that knows how to tend not just others, but herself. Within the pattern of the accommodating feminine lies the wisdom of the one who understands relationship and connection, who can choose when to flow and when to stand firm. The danger lies not in these archetypal energies themselves, but in living them unconsciously, in allowing them to possess you, rather than conscious choosing how to embody their gifts. When you live unconsciously, you become the archetype rather than working with it. You lose yourself in the role, rather than using the role as one instrument in the orchestra of your full being. In the depths of the chrysalis, you may begin to sense that there are other women moving in the darkness, women throughout history, who have felt this same stirring, this same call to awakening. You are not alone in this experience, though it may feel intensely solitary. You are part of an ancient lineage of women who have heard the soul's call and answered, despite the danger, despite the fear, despite the chorus of voices that insisted. They remain asleep. Some of these women you know from history, those who broke barriers, who spoke truth, who refused to accept the limitations placed upon them. But there are countless others whose names were never recorded, who made the journey from unconsciousness to consciousness in the quiet spaces of their own lives, who transformed themselves and, in doing so, contributed to the transformation of the collective feminine. You are connected to these women through the invisible threads of the archetypal feminine that runs through all of human experience. Their courage lives in your cells. Their wisdom whispers in your dreams. Their victories make your own awakening possible, just as your awakening will make it easier for women who come after you. But to access this ancestral wisdom, you must first become conscious of your own slumber. You must develop what Jung called the observing ego, the part of you that can step back and witness your own patterns without judgment, with curiosity about how you came to be living a life that feels like someone else's dream. This witnessing is the first crack in the chrysalis. It is the moment when you begin to see the threads that bind you, not as permanent fixtures, but as choices that can be examined, questioned, and ultimately unwoven. It is the recognition that the voice in your head that tells you who you should be is not your own voice, but the internalized voice of 1,000 external authorities who never knew the true you. The slumbering chrysalis is maintained by what Jung called the superior function, the psychological function you have overdeveloped to adapt to your environment. Perhaps you have become the woman who thinks everything through rationally, suppressing feeling and intuition. Perhaps you have become purely feeling, making every decision based on how others will react, never asking what you actually want. Perhaps you have become so focused on sensing the immediate environment that you have lost touch with the larger patterns and possibilities of your life. Whatever function you have overdeveloped has served you well in navigating your world, but it has also kept other parts of you in the shadows. The journey of awakening will require you to develop these inferior functions, to let the overly rational woman discover her feelings, to let the perpetual pleaser find her fierce boundaries, to let the woman lost in details glimpse the vast horizons of possibility. This is terrifying because it means releasing the very adaptations that have kept you safe. It means admitting that the identity you have worked so hard to perfect is only a partial truth about who you are. It means acknowledging that there are entire continents of yourself that you have never explored, languages of the soul that you have never learned to speak. Yet the soul grows restless when it is not acknowledged. Like any living thing kept too long in artificial conditions, it begins to wither or to rebel. You may notice that the strategies that once brought you peace no longer work. The approval you once craved may begin to feel hollow. The roles you once inhabited with such dedication may start to feel like costumes that no longer fit. This restlessness is not a problem to be solved, but a message to be received. It is the soul's way of saying that the time of unconscious living is coming to an end. It is the first whisper of the dangerous power that awaits you, the power of living as your authentic self in a world that profits from your self-abandonment. In the final moments of dwelling in the slumbering chrysalis, you may experience what mystics have called the dark night of the soul, a period of profound disconnection from everything that once brought meaning. This is not depression, though it may resemble it. This is the necessary emptying that precedes all filling, the dissolution that makes room for a new form of consciousness. To emerge, you may feel as though you are dying, and in a sense you are. The false self, the adapted self, the self that has lived for everyone but you, this self must die for the true self to be born. This is what Jung meant by psychological death and rebirth, the fundamental pattern of all deep transformation. The chrysalis has served its purpose. It has protected you during the long season of preparation, keeping you safe while unseen forces work to prepare you for a different kind of existence. But now the walls that once protected have become the barriers that constrain. Now the darkness that once comforted has become the tomb from which you must emerge, and somewhere in the deepest part of you, beneath all the layers of conditioning and adaptation, beneath all the fears and doubts, beneath everything you think you know about yourself and your limitations, an ancient knowing stirs. It remembers what you came here to be. It remembers the power you were born to embody. It remembers that you are not meant to live someone else's idea of your life. This knowing is your true north, your inner compass, your connection to the self that exists beyond all personas and roles. It is the part of you that has never been asleep, though it has been quiet. It is the part of you that knows the difference between genuine safety and the illusion of control, between authentic love and conditional approval, between living and merely surviving. The moment is approaching when this knowing will demand to be heard, when the chrysalis will split open, when the dangerous journey of becoming yourself will begin. You stand now at the threshold between worlds, the world of unconscious adaptation and the world of conscious choice, the world of living for others and the world of living from your deepest truth. The dangerous power she discovers the moment. She knows herself begins here, in this recognition that she has been living in a chrysalis of her own making, and that the time has come to break free. The breaking will not be gentle. The emergence will not be easy, but on the other side of this transformation waits a woman she has never met, but has always been, the woman she came here to become. There comes a moment when the darkness that has held you splits open like an eggshell struck by the force of new life within. This moment cannot be planned or predicted. It arrives like dawn, inevitable yet always surprising, bringing with it the first crack of light that will forever change how you see yourself and your world. This is not the gradual brightening of ordinary morning, but the sudden illumination that comes when consciousness pierces through layers of unconscious living, like lightning splitting the night sky. You may be standing at your bathroom mirror, brushing your teeth in the mechanical rhythm of countless other mornings, when suddenly you see her, not the familiar stranger who has been looking back at you for years, but you, the real you, the you that exists beneath all the masks and roles and carefully constructed presentations. For just a moment, the persona drops away completely, and you are face to face with your own essence, raw and unfiltered and startlingly real. The shock of this recognition reverberates through every cell of your being. It is as if you have been living in a house of mirrors, surrounded by distorted reflections of yourself, and suddenly one mirror becomes clear, showing you your true face. The woman looking back at you is not who you expected to see. She is wilder, more complex, carrying depths you never suspected existed. There is power in her eyes that you have never allowed yourself to claim, intelligence that you have learned to dim, fierce beauty that you have taught yourself to minimize. This first moment of authentic self-recognition is both liberation and terror. Liberation, because finally you see yourself as you truly are, rather than as you have been taught to be. Terror, because this seeing changes everything. It makes impossible the unconscious life you have been living, makes unbearable the compromises you have been making, makes intolerable the ways you have been betraying your own truth. Jung understood this moment as the first stirring of what he called the individuation process, that fundamental drive within the human psyche to become whole, to integrate all aspects of the self, to move from unconscious identification with collective patterns toward conscious relationship with your own unique essence. But he also knew that this process begins with disruption, with the comfortable illusions of the ego being shattered by the insistent presence of something larger and more real. The ego, that part of your psyche that has worked so hard to maintain a consistent and acceptable image, recoils from this recognition like a child startled by a sudden loud noise. It begins immediately to rebuild the familiar defenses, to explain away what you have seen, to convince you that this glimpse of your authentic self was just a trick of light, a momentary lapse in judgment, nothing to be taken seriously. You were just tired, the ego whispers. You were just emotional. You were just having a moment. Go back to being who you're supposed to be. Go back to being safe. The ego is not malicious in this response. It is simply doing what it was designed to do, which is to maintain stability and protect you from perceived threats. And to the ego, nothing is more threatening than the authentic self, because the authentic self cannot be controlled or predicted or made to fit into convenient categories. But once you have seen yourself truly, even for a moment, that seeing leaves a mark on your consciousness like a photograph burned into film by overexposure to light. You cannot unsee what you have seen. You cannot unknow what you now know. The crack in the chrysalis has appeared, and though it may seem small and insignificant, it has begun the irreversible process of your emergence. This first crack of light often appears in moments when your usual defenses are down, when the constant vigilance of the ego relaxes just enough to allow truth to surface. It might come in the pause between sleep and waking, in those liminal seconds when you are not yet fully committed to the day's performance. It might emerge in a moment of crisis, when the familiar structures of your life suddenly feel inadequate to contain what you are experiencing. It might break through during an encounter with beauty so profound that it strips away all pretense and leaves you standing naked before mystery. The light that enters through this crack is not ordinary light. It is the light of consciousness itself, the illumination that reveals not just what you have been hiding from others, but what you have been hiding from yourself. This light shows you the parts of yourself that you have pushed into shadow, the qualities you have denied, the dreams you have abandoned, the voices within you that you have silenced in service of being acceptable, being safe, being who others needed you to be. You begin to see how much energy you have been expending to maintain the false self, how exhausting it has been to constantly monitor your words, your expressions, your very thoughts to ensure they align with who you think you should be. You realize that you have been living your life as if you were an actor playing a role, but somewhere along the way, you forgot you were acting and began to believe the role was all you were. This recognition brings with it a profound sadness, grief, for all the years lost to unconscious living, mourning for the parts of yourself that have withered from neglect, sorrow for all the choices made from fear rather than love, from obligation rather than authentic desire. This is not self-pity, but sacred grieving, the necessary honoring of what must be mourned before it can be transformed. Yet alongside the grief comes something else, a stirring of excitement, a quickening of life force, a sense that you are finally beginning to wake up from the long sleep of unconscious existence. You feel like a woman who has been sleepwalking through her own life and is just now opening her eyes to discover where she actually is, what she is actually capable of, who she actually came here to be. The first crack of light reveals not just your authentic self, but the vast distance between who you truly are and who you have been pretending to be. This gap can feel overwhelming. How do you bridge such a chasm? How do you begin to close the space between your authentic truth and your lived reality? How do you start to embody the woman you saw in that moment of clear seeing? Jung would say that this is exactly the right question, because it indicates that the process of individuation has truly begun. The gap between the false self and the authentic self is not a problem to be solved, but a creative tension to be explored. It is the fertile space where transformation occurs, where the old form dissolves and the new form emerges. But this process cannot be rushed or forced. The chrysalis does not split open all at once. It cracks gradually, allowing more and more light to enter, until eventually the old container can no longer hold the growing life within. Each crack of light brings new seeing, new awareness, new understanding of who you are, beneath all the layers of conditioning and adaptation. You may find yourself becoming hypersensitive to moments when you betray your own truth. The small compromises that once felt automatic now register as sharp pains in your psyche. The words you speak that are not quite true, the yes you give when you mean no, the smile you wear when your heart is heavy, all of these begin to feel intolerable in ways they never did before. This is not neurosis but awakening. You are developing what Jung called the ethical function, the capacity to live in alignment with your deepest values, rather than simply adapting to external expectations. The light that enters through the first crack also illuminates the projections you have been carrying, those aspects of yourself that you have disowned and attributed to others. You begin to see how you have given your power away by imagining that strength, wisdom, creativity, or authority belong to other people, rather than recognizing these qualities as potentials within yourself. You start to understand that the people you most admire are reflecting back to you your own unlived possibilities, and the people you most dislike are showing you the shadow qualities you have refused to acknowledge. This recognition of projection is both humbling and empowering. Humbling because you see how much you have been living in illusion, relating to your own projections rather than to the actual people around you. Empowering because you begin to reclaim the energy that has been scattered in projections and pull it back into yourself, where it can be used for your own growth and transformation. The first crack of light also brings the recognition that you are not who your family thinks you are, who your friends expect you to be, who your culture has told you you should become. You are something entirely unique, a combination of potentials and possibilities that has never existed before and will never exist again. This uniqueness is not something to be hidden or apologized for. It is the gift you came to bring to the world, but claiming this uniqueness requires enormous courage because it means stepping away from the safety of conformity and into the unknown territory of authentic selfhood. It means disappointing people who have become attached to the false version of you. It means facing the fear that if you show your true self, you might be rejected, abandoned, misunderstood, or alone. Yet the light that has entered cannot be put back into darkness. Once consciousness has awakened, once you have seen yourself, truly, there is no path back to unconscious living, only forward into deeper and deeper levels of authentic being. The crack of light becomes a doorway through which your true self begins to emerge, tentatively at first, like a wild animal that has been caged, learning to trust its own freedom. You may notice that your dreams become more vivid, more symbolic, filled with images of breaking free, of flying, of finding hidden rooms in familiar houses. These are the dreams of the awakening self, the psyche's way of processing the enormous shift that is taking place in your consciousness. The unconscious is no longer content to remain unconscious. It wants to be seen, heard, integrated into your conscious life. This integration is not a comfortable process. It requires what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites, living simultaneously with the part of you that wants to retreat back into the safety of unconscious living, and the part that is irresistibly drawn toward the light of authentic selfhood. This tension can manifest as anxiety, as restlessness, as a constant feeling of being between worlds, no longer comfortable in the old life, but not yet established in the new. The ego often interprets this discomfort as evidence that something is wrong, that you should go back to the way things were, that this awakening is dangerous and should be avoided. But what you are experiencing is not pathology, but emergence, the natural discomfort that comes when any living thing outgrows its container and begins to break free. In these moments of tension, you need the wisdom of the transcendent function, that mysterious capacity of the psyche to hold paradox, to find a third way that honors both the need for security and the call to growth. You learn to be gentle with the part of you that is afraid, while also honoring the part that is ready to be born. You develop patience with the process, understanding that transformation cannot be rushed without being damaged. The first crack of light also brings the recognition that you are connected to something larger than your individual ego, to what Jung called the self, that archetypal pattern of wholeness that exists beyond personal identity. You begin to sense that your awakening is not just about you, but part of a larger movement of consciousness, a collective stirring toward greater authenticity and wholeness. This recognition can bring both comfort and responsibility. Comfort because you understand that you are not alone in this process, that countless others have walked this path of awakening before you, and countless others are walking it alongside you now. Responsibility, because you begin to see that your own healing and wholeness contribute to the healing and wholeness of the collective, that every step you take toward authentic selfhood makes it easier for others to take the same journey. As the first crack of light widens and more illumination enters your consciousness, you may experience what mystics call the return of the exiled self, those parts of you that were sent into shadow during your early adaptation to the world. These aspects of yourself return not as strangers, but as long-lost friends, carrying gifts and wisdom that have been waiting for you to be ready to receive them. The creative self that was deemed impractical begins to stir with new ideas and visions. The wild self that was told to be civilized starts to remember the joy of unfiltered expression. The wise self that was taught to defer to others begins to speak with quiet authority. The powerful self that was made to feel dangerous starts to reclaim its rightful place in your psyche. This return of the exiled aspects is not always smooth or comfortable. They may arrive with anger about their long banishment, with grief about all they have missed, with urgency about making up for lost time. Learning to integrate these returning aspects requires patience, compassion, and the willingness to expand your sense of who you are to include parts of yourself you never imagined you could embody. The first crack of light reveals that the journey ahead will not be easy, but it also reveals that it is absolutely necessary. You cannot unknow what you now know about yourself. You cannot unsee the woman you glimpsed in that moment of clear recognition. You cannot go back to the unconscious life you were living before awareness broke through like dawn after the longest night of your soul. And perhaps most importantly, the first crack of light reveals that this dangerous power you are beginning to discover, this capacity to live as your authentic self rather than as who others need you to be, is not something to be feared, but something to be honored. It is the power that will free you from the prison of other people's expectations and return you to the sovereignty of your own truth. It is the light that will guide you through the darkness of transformation and illuminate the path to becoming who you were always meant to be. The first crack of light does not lead upward into ethereal realms of spiritual transcendence, as the ego might hope, but downward into the dark territories of the psyche where your rejected aspects have been dwelling in exile. This descent is not optional. It is the necessary passage that every soul must make on its journey toward wholeness. Like Persephone being pulled into the underworld, like Inanna descending through the 7 gates, you must go down before you can truly rise. The shadow realm is not a place of evil, though it may appear so to the conscious mind that has worked so hard to maintain a clean and acceptable image. It is simply the repository of everything you have deemed unacceptable about yourself. Every impulse you have suppressed, every emotion you have denied, every aspect of your nature that you were taught was too much, too intense, too dangerous to be allowed expression in the light of ordinary consciousness. Here, in this underground kingdom of the psyche, dwells the woman you were never allowed to be. She has been waiting for you in the darkness, growing stronger in her exile, more insistent in her desire to be acknowledged. She is the one who feels too deeply in a world that demands emotional moderation. She is the one who wants too much in a culture that teaches women to be satisfied with scraps. She is the one who speaks too boldly in a society that rewards feminine silence and accommodation. This shadow woman is not your enemy, though she may initially appear as such. She is your ally, your teacher, your gateway to the authentic power that lies buried beneath layers of socialization and self-denial. But to access her gifts, you must first be willing to meet her on her own terms, in her own territory, without trying to change her or civilize her or make her more palatable to your conscious sensibilities. The descent into the shadow realm often begins with projection, suddenly seeing in others the very qualities you have disowned in yourself. The woman who seems too aggressive, too selfish, too sexual, too angry, she becomes a mirror, reflecting back the aspects of yourself that you have pushed into darkness. Your intense reaction to her is a clue that she is carrying something that belongs to you, something you need to reclaim if you are ever to become whole. Jung understood that what we most despise in others is often what we most fear to acknowledge in ourselves. The shadow appears first as the other, the person who embodies everything we have decided we are not, everything we have worked so hard to avoid becoming. But this projection is a gift, because it shows us exactly where to look for the lost pieces of our own souls. You may find yourself inexplicably drawn to stories of women who break rules, who refuse to conform, who live life on their own terms regardless of social consequences. These women fascinate and repel you simultaneously. You judge them, even as you secretly admire their freedom, criticize their choices, even as you envy their courage to make them. This fascination is the shadow calling to you, showing you possibilities you have never allowed yourself to consider. The woman who leaves her marriage to pursue her art. You may condemn her selfishness while secretly wondering what it would feel like to choose your creative passion over security and social approval. The woman who speaks her truth, even when it makes others uncomfortable. You may criticize her lack of consideration while inwardly recognizing the relief it might bring to stop editing every word for its effect on others. The woman who takes up space, who refuses to shrink herself to make others comfortable. You may judge her arrogance while sensing the freedom that might come from claiming your right to exist fully in the world. These projections are breadcrumbs leading you back to your own disowned power. Each shadow figure you encounter in the outer world is an invitation to look within, to examine what aspect of yourself you have exiled, to consider what gifts might be hidden in the very qualities you have learned to fear or despise. But projection is only the beginning of shadow work. The real descent occurs when you begin to turn your attention inward, to explore the dark territories of your own psyche with the same curiosity you might bring to exploring a foreign country. This requires enormous courage, because you are venturing into the parts of yourself that have been labeled as bad, wrong, unacceptable, dangerous. In the shadow realm, you meet the angry woman who has been swallowing her rage for decades, storing it in her body until it manifested as chronic pain, unexplained illness, or depression. This anger is not petty or personal. It is the righteous fury of a soul that has been systematically denied expression, a life force that has been damned, up until it either stagnates or erupts. To meet this anger is to understand that it is not something to be gotten rid of, but something to be honored, channeled, used as fuel for necessary change. Here, too, you encounter the selfish woman, the one who knows what she wants and is not ashamed to want it. She's been buried beneath layers of conditioning that taught you to put everyone else's needs first, to find your value in how much you could give and how little you required in return. This selfish woman is not cruel or uncaring. She simply understands that self-betrayal in service of others is no true service at all, that you cannot give from an empty well, that claiming your own needs and desires is a prerequisite for authentic relationship. In the depths of the shadow, you meet the sexual woman, the one who owns her desire and is not apologetic about her body's hungers. She has been hidden away, because feminine sexuality is simultaneously worshipped and feared, celebrated and shamed, used to sell everything while being treated as something dangerous that must be controlled and contained. This sexual woman knows her own pleasure, trusts her own instincts, refuses to perform sexuality for others' consumption while denying it for her own experience. The shadow realm also holds the wild woman, the one who has never learned to color inside the lines, who follows her instincts rather than social scripts, who trusts her own knowing more than external authorities. She has been exiled because wild women are unpredictable, uncontrollable, unmanageable by systems that depend on feminine compliance and accommodation. This wild woman carries the medicine of authenticity, the gift of living from the inside out, rather than constantly adapting to external expectations. Here in the darkness lives the ambitious woman, the one who hungers for achievement, recognition, impact in the world. She has been hidden because feminine ambition is often seen as unwomanly, as a betrayal of the caring, nurturing role women are supposed to embody above all else. This ambitious woman knows that she has gifts to offer the world, contributions, to make that go beyond supporting and facilitating others' dreams and visions. As you descend deeper into the shadow realm, you may encounter what Jung called the archetypal shadow, not just your personal disowned qualities, but the collective, shadow of the feminine that has been suppressed throughout centuries of patriarchal civilization. Here dwells the witch, the crone, the dark goddess, archetypes of feminine power that have been systematically demonized because they represent the aspects of feminine nature that cannot be controlled or contained by masculine-dominated systems. Meeting these archetypal figures requires you to expand your understanding of what it means to be a woman beyond the narrow definitions you have inherited. The witch is not evil. She is the woman who trusts her own wisdom, who works with natural forces, who refuses to have her power mediated by external authorities. The crone is not hideous. She is the woman who has moved beyond the need for approval, who speaks truth without concern for its palatability, who embodies the wisdom that comes from having lived fully. The dark goddess is not destructive. She is the force of necessary endings, the power that clears away what no longer serves to make space for new growth. These archetypal energies live within every woman, but they have been driven so far underground that most women have lost touch with them entirely. Reclaiming them is not about becoming literal witches or rejecting all social connection, but about integrating these powerful aspects of feminine nature that have been split off and denied. The descent into shadow is accompanied by what alchemists call the nigredo, the blackening that precedes all transformation. This is a period of dissolution, confusion, and apparent chaos as the carefully constructed identity begins to break down and reveal what lies beneath. Everything you thought you knew about yourself becomes questionable. The values you have lived by seem suddenly arbitrary. The relationships you have built on false foundations begin to crumble. This dissolution is terrifying to the ego, which interprets it as death, as failure, as evidence that you should never have begun this journey in the first place. The ego will do everything it can to pull you back to the surface, back to the familiar light of conventional consciousness, back to the safety of living as who others expect you to be, rather than who you actually are. But the nigredo is not collapse. It is composting. It is the necessary breakdown of old forms that makes possible the emergence of something entirely new. Just as the seed must dissolve in darkness before it can sprout, just as the caterpillar must completely liquefy within the chrysalis before it can become a butterfly, your old identity must undergo dissolution before your authentic self can emerge. In the shadow realm, you learn that what you have called your darkness is often your greatest source of power. The very qualities you have spent a lifetime suppressing may be the keys to your liberation. The anger you have swallowed becomes the fierce boundary setting that protects your energy. The selfishness you have denied becomes the healthy self-regard that allows you to show up fully for life. The wildness you have tamed becomes the spontaneity and authenticity that makes you magnetic and alive. This is not about becoming selfish, angry, or wild in destructive ways, but about integrating these energies consciously, using them in service of your highest development, rather than being unconsciously possessed by them or rigidly defending against them. Shadow integration is not about acting out every impulse, but about owning every aspect of your nature so that you can choose consciously how to express your full range of human possibilities. The shadow realm also teaches you about the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am bad. Much of what you have relegated to shadow carries not guilt, but shame, the deep sense that certain aspects of your nature are fundamentally flawed or unacceptable. Shadow work is the process of transforming shame back into guilt, recognizing that there may be behaviors you want to change without needing to reject entire aspects of yourself. As you spend time in the shadow realm, you begin to understand that Every so-called negative quality has a positive counterpart. Every apparent flaw contains a hidden gift. The woman who has been called too sensitive may discover that her sensitivity is actually a powerful form of perception, a gift for reading, energy and emotion that can be of great service in the world. The woman who has been labeled too intense may find that her intensity is passion, life force, the very fire that can fuel her creative expression and authentic engagement with life. This recognition of the gifts hidden within apparent flaws is one of the great revelations of shadow work. You begin to see that you have been rejecting not your weaknesses, but your strengths, not your limitations, but your possibilities. The very qualities that made you feel different, wrong, or too much may be the sources of your unique contribution to the world. The descent into shadow also reveals the ways you have been complicit in your own oppression, the ways you have internalized external judgments and turned them against yourself. You see how you have been your own harshest critic, your own most effective jailer, enforcing limitations that others may have suggested, but that you ultimately chose to accept. This recognition is painful, but also empowering, because what you have participated in creating, you have the power to change. In the deepest part of the shadow realm, you encounter what Jung called the treasure hard to attain, the aspect of yourself that carries your greatest gifts and your most essential nature. This treasure has been hidden in the darkness, not because it is evil, but because it is so precious, so powerful, that it had to be protected from a world that was not yet ready to receive it. This is the part of you that knows your true purpose, your authentic calling, your unique way of serving life. Meeting this treasure requires you to release your attachment to being seen as good, nice, appropriate, or acceptable. It requires you to value authenticity over approval, truth over comfort, wholeness over partial acceptance. It demands that you be willing to disappoint others in order to be true to yourself, to risk rejection in order to claim your real identity. The shadow realm teaches you that what makes you dangerous to systems of oppression is not your darkness, but your light, not your flaws, but your power, not your limitations, but your limitless potential. A woman who knows and owns her full range of human possibilities is infinitely more threatening to status quo than a woman who has learned to deny and suppress the aspects of herself that don't fit conventional expectations. As you prepare to emerge from the shadow realm, you carry with you not just the individual aspects you have reclaimed, but a new understanding of the nature of wholeness itself. You see that integration is not about becoming perfect, but about becoming complete, owning all aspects of your nature so that you can choose consciously how to express them rather than being unconsciously driven by them or rigidly defended against them. The ascent from the shadow realm does not mean leaving the darkness behind. It means bringing the gifts of the darkness into the light, integrating what you have learned about your complete nature into your conscious life. You emerge not as who you were before the descent, but as someone entirely new, someone who has faced her own darkness and found it to be not evil, but essential. Not something to be overcome, but something to be embraced as part of the totality of her being. This integration of shadow is what gives birth to authentic power, not power over others, but power from within, the unshakable confidence that comes from knowing and accepting yourself completely. This is the beginning of the dangerous power she discovers the moment she knows herself, because a woman who has made peace with her own darkness can no longer be controlled by the threat of having it exposed. From the depths of the collective, unconscious, something ancient begins to stir, something that has been sleeping for millennia, buried beneath layers of civilization, suppressed by centuries of conditioning that taught women to be small, quiet, accommodating, grateful for whatever scraps of power they were allowed to hold. This is not your personal anger rising, though it moves through your personal experience. This is the rage of the archetypal feminine itself, the fury of the goddess who has been systematically diminished, demonized, and driven underground by patriarchal systems that could not tolerate her wild, uncontrollable power. This rage arrives like a tsunami, overwhelming in its intensity, shocking in its depth. You may have spent decades believing you were not an angry person, priding yourself on your patience, your understanding, your ability to see all sides of every situation. You may have learned to swallow your anger so completely that you forgot you had the right to feel it at all. But now it rises like molten lava from the core of the earth, demanding to be felt, to be witnessed, to be honored as the sacred fire it has always been. This is not the petty irritation of everyday frustrations, though it may have been disguised as such for years. This is the primordial rage of Kali, the Hindu goddess who dances on the chest of destruction to birth new worlds. This is the fury of Sekhmet, the Egyptian lioness goddess whose rage could destroy armies, but whose power could also heal nations. This is the wildfire of Pele, the Hawaiian volcano goddess who consumes what no longer serves to create new land, new possibilities, new life from the ashes of the old. Your rage carries within it the accumulated fury of every woman who has been told she was too much, too loud, too ambitious, too sexual, too powerful. It holds the grief turned to anger of countless grandmothers who swallowed their dreams to serve others, who made themselves smaller to make others comfortable, who died, with their songs unsung and their gifts unopened. This rage is not pathology, it is prophecy, announcing the end of an era in which feminine power was contained, controlled, and channeled only in service of systems that never honored its true nature. When this archetypal rage begins to move through you, it can be terrifying. You may feel as though you are being possessed by something larger than yourself, and in a sense, you are. You are being moved by the collective force of feminine awakening that is occurring across the planet as women everywhere begin to remember who they were before they learn to forget themselves. This rage is not yours alone to carry. It belongs to the movement of consciousness itself, the evolutionary impulse toward greater wholeness and authenticity. The ego recoils from this intensity, labeling it as dangerous, destructive, inappropriate. You may hear internal voices telling you to calm down, to be reasonable, to remember your responsibilities, to think about how your anger affects others. These are the voices of internalized oppression, the ways you have learned to police your own power to keep it within acceptable bounds. But this rage cannot be reasoned away or suppressed without consequence. It is the life force itself demanding expression, demanding that you stop betraying your own truth in service of others' comfort. This rage often emerges after the shadow work has begun, when you start to see clearly how much of yourself you have sacrificed on the altar of social acceptability. You begin to understand the magnitude of the self-betrayal you have been engaging in, the ways you have colluded with systems that diminished your power, the countless times you said yes when you meant no, smiled when you wanted to scream, made yourself small to fit into spaces never designed to contain your vastness. The fury that rises is not just about what has been done to you, it is about what you have allowed to be done, what you have participated in through your silence, your accommodation, your willingness to accept less than you deserved in order to maintain peace, approval, connection. This recognition can bring waves of rage so intense they feel like they might shatter you. But this shattering is exactly what is needed to break open the crystallized patterns that have kept you imprisoned in a life too small for your soul. Jung understood that rage, when it arises from the depths of the psyche, often carries within it the energy needed for transformation. This is not the ego's anger, which is usually defensive and reactive, but the self's fury at being denied expression, at being forced to remain hidden while the false self performed the acceptable version of femininity for an unconscious world. This rage is sacred because it arises in defense of your authentic nature, your true calling, your right to exist fully in the world as who you actually are, rather than who others need you to be. The goddess rage that moves through you may manifest in surprising ways. You may find yourself unable to tolerate situations that once seemed normal, the meeting where your ideas are dismissed or appropriated, the family gathering where your achievements are minimized while others are celebrated, the social situation where you are expected to play the supportive role while others take center stage. What once felt like minor irritations now feel like profound violations of your sovereignty, your dignity, your right to be seen and valued for who you truly are. This increased sensitivity is not oversensitivity. It is the return of your natural, protective instincts, the reactivation of your inner alarm system that was trained into silence through years of conditioning. You are learning to recognize the subtle ways your energy is drained, your power diminished, your authentic self suppressed in service of maintaining relationships and systems that require your self-abandonment as the price of belonging. The rage of the repressed goddess is also the rage of unlived life, unexpressed creativity, dreams deferred in service of others' dreams. It carries the fury of every woman who was told her art didn't matter, her vision wasn't practical, her calling wasn't realistic. It holds the accumulated grief of generations of women who chose security over authenticity, approval over truth, survival over thriving, and passed down this pattern of self-denial like a genetic inheritance. When this collective rage moves through your individual psyche, you become a conduit for healing not just your own wounds, but the wounds of the feminine lineage itself. Your willingness to feel this fury fully, to let it burn through you without trying to control or suppress it, contributes to the healing of the collective feminine soul that has been traumatized by millennia of oppression, suppression, and systematic disempowerment. But this rage must be met with consciousness, with the understanding that feeling it fully does not mean acting it out destructively. The goddess rage is not about becoming violent or cruel. It is about reclaiming the fierce protective energy that guards what is sacred, that says no to what diminishes life, that refuses to participate in systems that require self-betrayal. As the price of inclusion, this rage teaches you the difference between anger that destroys and anger that creates, between fury that harms and fury that heals. As you learn to work with this archetypal rage consciously, you discover that it is one of your greatest sources of power. It burns away everything that is false, everything that no longer serves, everything that was built on compromise and self-denial. Like the forest fire that clears away dead underbrush to make space for new growth, this rage consumes the old structures of your life that were based on unconscious patterns and creates space for something authentic to emerge. The rage teaches you about healthy aggression, not the aggressive behavior that seeks to dominate or harm others, but the life force that moves toward what you want, that claims what belongs to you, that refuses to accept less than you deserve. You learn that aggression, in its healthy form, is simply energy moving toward a goal, life force directed with intention and purpose. Women are often taught to fear their own aggression, to see it as unfeminine, but without access to this energy, you cannot claim your place in the world or protect what matters most to you. This goddess rage also teaches you about boundaries, not the rigid walls that shut out relationship, but the flexible, permeable boundaries that allow in what nourishes while keeping out what depletes. You learn to say no with the fierce love of a mother protecting her child, understanding that your energy, your time, your life force are sacred resources that must be stewarded wisely. You discover that setting boundaries is not selfish but necessary, not mean but merciful, not aggressive but protective. The fury that moves through you may also reveal the ways you have been unconsciously participating in your own oppression, how you have internalized the voice of the oppressor and turned it against yourself. You see how you have been your own harshest critic, your own most effective prison guard, enforcing limitations that may have been suggested by others, but that you ultimately chose to accept as truth about what was possible for you. This recognition brings another wave of rage, fury at yourself for the years of self-betrayal, the dreams abandoned, the gifts left unopened, the life unlived in service of being acceptable to others. But this self-directed anger must also be met with compassion, with the understanding that you were doing the best you could with the consciousness you had at the time. You were trying to survive, to belong, to find love and acceptance in whatever ways seemed available to you. The goddess rage that moves through you is also the rage of the mother, not just the biological mother, but the archetypal mother who protects life in all its forms. This rage rises when you see how life force has been suppressed, how creativity has been stifled, how the natural impulses toward growth and expression have been channeled into narrow, acceptable forms. You feel this fury not just for yourself, but for all women, all life, all expressions of authentic power that have been diminished by systems that fear what they cannot control. This maternal rage teaches you about fierce compassion, love that is strong enough to say difficult truths, to set necessary boundaries, to refuse to enable unconscious behavior in yourself or others. You learn that real love sometimes requires disappointing people, challenging them, refusing to participate in their unconscious patterns, even when it would be easier to go along with the familiar dynamics. As the archetypal rage moves through you may experience what Jung called inflation, the ego's tendency to identify completely with archetypal energies rather than serving as a conscious channel for them. You might begin to see yourself as a victim of universal injustice or as a crusader called to single-handedly right all wrongs. This inflation is a natural part of the process, but it must be worked through consciously to avoid being possessed by the very energies you are trying to integrate. The key to working with goddess rage without becoming inflated is to remember that you are a vessel for these energies, not their ultimate source or destination. You are part of a much larger process of collective healing and transformation. Your individual rage is connected to the archetypal rage, but it is not identical to it. You must find ways to honor and express these powerful energies without losing yourself in them or using them to justify unconscious behavior. The rage of the repressed goddess also teaches you about the difference between power and force. Force tries to impose its will through domination, control, or manipulation. Power simply is. It attracts, magnetizes, transforms through its very presence. As you learn to work with your rage consciously, you discover that your real power lies not in your ability to control or change others, but in your capacity to be fully yourself, regardless of how others respond. This rage becomes a burning ground that transforms everything it touches. Relationships that were based on your willingness to be less than you are, either deepen to accommodate your authentic self or dissolve to make space for connections that can honor your full humanity. Work that required you to suppress your true gifts either evolves to make use of your real talents or releases you to find your authentic calling. Living situations that demanded constant self-compromise either transform to support your growth or crumble to create space for environments that nourish your soul. The goddess rage teaches you that destruction is often the most loving act you, can perform, not destruction for its own sake, but the sacred destruction that clears away what no longer serves to make space for what wants to emerge. You learn to trust the intelligence of this destructive force, to see it not as mindless chaos, but as the fierce wisdom that knows when something has outlived its usefulness and must be composted to nourish new growth. As this archetypal rage burns through the structures of your old life, you may feel as though you are losing everything: your identity, your relationships, your security, your place in the world. But what you are actually losing are the false constructions that were built on self-betrayal, the connections that required you to abandon yourself, the security that was purchased with the sacrifice of your authenticity. What emerges from the ashes is infinitely more valuable: the unshakable foundation of self-knowledge, relationships based on genuine recognition, security that comes from trusting your own inner authority. The rage of the repressed goddess is not something to be gotten through quickly or gotten over completely. It is a force that will continue to move through you whenever you encounter situations that require you to betray your truth. Whenever you are asked to make yourself smaller to accommodate others' comfort, whenever life force is being suppressed or creativity stifled, this rage becomes your ally, your inner alarm system, your fierce protector of what is sacred within you. Learning to work with this archetypal rage transforms you from someone who seeks to be liked into someone who demands to be respected, from someone who tries to fit in into someone who belongs to herself first and foremost. This is part of the dangerous power she discovers the moment she knows herself, the power to refuse participation in systems that require self-abandonment, the power to protect her own life force as fiercely as she would protect a beloved child, the power to say no to what diminishes life and yes to what serves the highest expression of her authentic nature. Like ancient towers struck by lightning, the structures that once defined your existence begin to crumble. What once seemed permanent and unchangeable reveals itself to be nothing more than sandcastles built on shifting shores, elaborate constructions that could never withstand the storm of awakened consciousness now moving through your life. This is enantiodromia in action, Jung's term for the great reversal, where everything transforms into its opposite, where what was once order becomes chaos, where safety transforms into suffocation, where the very foundations you built your life upon reveal themselves to be prisons disguised as protection. The crumbling begins slowly, almost imperceptibly. A crack appears in the wall of a relationship you thought was solid, letting in light that illuminates corners you never knew existed. A tremor runs through your career, revealing how much of your professional identity was built on pleasing others, rather than expressing your authentic gifts. A foundation stone shifts in your family dynamics, and suddenly the entire structure of roles and expectations that held everything together begins to sway precariously in the wind of your changing consciousness. At first, you may try to shore up these crumbling structures, to repair the cracks and reinforce the foundations. The ego, terrified by the dissolution of everything familiar, mobilizes all its resources to maintain the status quo. You find yourself working harder to be who you have always been, performing your roles with increasing desperation, trying to convince yourself and others that nothing has changed, that you are still the same person who fits so neatly into the boxes others had constructed for you. But consciousness, once awakened, cannot be put back to sleep. The woman who has glimpsed her authentic self, who has descended into her shadow and felt the rage of the repressed goddess, cannot unknow what she now knows about her own nature. The structures that once contained her now feel like straitjackets, and every attempt to squeeze back into them causes physical and psychic pain that cannot be ignored or explained away. This is when you begin to see how much of your life was built on unconscious agreements, unspoken contracts that required you to remain small, predictable, manageable in exchange for love, security, belonging. You see how these agreements shaped every aspect of your existence. The work you chose, that was safe rather than fulfilling. The relationships you maintained that nourished. Others, while depleting you, the living situations that provided security while stifling your growth. The social roles that gave you identity while cutting you off from your authentic self. The recognition of these unconscious contracts brings waves of grief and rage. Grief for all the years spent living a half-life, for all the dreams deferred and gifts unopened, for the woman you were before you learned to edit yourself for others' comfort. Rage at the systems that required such. Editing at the people who rewarded your self-abandonment. At yourself for participating so willingly in your own diminishment. This grief and rage are the earthquakes that shake the foundations until they can no longer hold the weight of the false structures built upon them. The crumbling is not random or chaotic. It follows the fault lines of inauthenticity, destroying what was false while revealing what has always been true. Relationships built on mutual unconsciousness, where both people agreed to play roles rather than meet as authentic beings, cannot survive the earthquake of one person's awakening. These relationships either transform completely, with both parties committed to meeting each other's authentic selves, or they dissolve with painful but necessary finality. You may watch in amazement and horror as friendships that seemed so solid reveal themselves to be built on shared complaints rather than genuine connection, on mutual enabling rather than mutual growth. The friend who always called to unload her problems but had no interest in your inner world becomes impossible to tolerate. The friend who loved you when you were struggling but feels threatened by your growing confidence begins to pull away or actively sabotage your progress. Professional structures that required you to suppress your authentic gifts in favor of playing. Expected roles become unbearable. The job that once felt secure now feels like a daily betrayal of your soul. The career path that once promised advancement now feels like a conveyor belt carrying you further and further away from your true calling. The professional identity you worked so hard to build reveals itself to be a costume you can no longer stand to wear. Family dynamics that depended on your willingness to play the role of the good daughter, the accommodating sister, the supportive wife, the selfless mother begin to crack under the pressure of your emerging authenticity. Family members who were comfortable with the version of you that asked for little and gave much react with confusion, anger, or manipulation when you begin to set boundaries, express needs, or pursue your own dreams with the same dedication you once gave to theirs. The process of these structures crumbling is not gentle or gradual. It often happens with the sudden violence of an avalanche. You may wake up one morning and find that you simply cannot continue living the life you have been living. The words you used to speak feel foreign in your mouth. The clothes you used to wear feel like costumes for a play you no longer want to perform in. The daily routines that once provided comfort now feel like prison schedules enforcing your captivity. This sudden inability to continue as you were can be terrifying. The ego interprets this dissolution as death, as complete failure, as evidence that you have lost your mind or your way. Well-meaning friends and family members may encourage you to get back to normal, to remember your responsibilities, to think about the consequences of changing too much too fast. But normal is exactly what can no longer be tolerated, and the consequences of not changing are far more devastating than the consequences of transformation. Jung understood that this dissolution of old forms is a necessary part of the individuation process. He called it the mortificatio, the psychological death that must occur before rebirth is possible, like the caterpillar that must completely dissolve within the chrysalis before it can become a butterfly. Your old identity must undergo radical dissolution before your authentic self can emerge. This is not failure but metamorphosis, not destruction but transformation. The crumbling reveals how much energy you were expending to maintain structures that were fundamentally at odds with your nature. You begin to see how exhausting it was to constantly monitor your words, edit your expressions, suppress your instincts, and perform a version of yourself that bore little resemblance to who you actually are. As these false structures collapse, you may initially feel depleted, but eventually you discover the vast reservoir of energy that was tied up in maintaining the illusion. During this phase of dissolution, you may experience what mystics call the dark night of the soul, a period of profound disorientation where nothing feels familiar or certain. You may feel as though you're floating in space with no reference points, no landmarks, no clear sense of direction. This disorientation is natural and necessary. You are in the space between worlds, no longer who you were, but not yet who you are becoming. The old structures often fight back as they crumble, as if they have their own survival instinct. People in your life who are comfortable with the old version of you may increase their efforts to pull you back into familiar patterns. They may use guilt, fear, anger, or manipulation to try to convince you to return to the role you played in their unconscious drama. They may remind you of your obligations, your commitments, your responsibilities to others, while conveniently forgetting your responsibility to yourself. These attempts to pull you back into the old structures are tests of your commitment to your own transformation. Each time you choose authenticity over approval, truth over comfort, your own growth over others' convenience, you strengthen your capacity to live from your center rather than from the periphery of others' expectations. You learn that disappointing others is not cruelty, but necessity when continuing to please them requires betraying yourself. The crumbling often reveals the degree to which your external life was out of alignment with your internal reality. You may realize that you have been living in environments that constantly drained your energy, surrounded by people who didn't see or appreciate your true nature, engaged in work that made no use of your authentic gifts, pursuing goals that belonged to others rather than arising from your own deepest desires. This recognition can bring profound grief, mourning for all the time spent building a life that was never truly yours, for all the energy invested in structures that could never support your authentic self, for all the opportunities missed while you were busy being who others needed you to be. But this grief, when fully felt, becomes the fertile soil from which new life grows. Every tear shed for what is dying waters the seeds of what wants to be born. As external structures crumble, you may also experience the dissolution of internal structures, beliefs about yourself and the world that once seemed unquestionable. The belief that you are not creative crumbles when suppressed artistic impulses begin to surface. The belief that you are not strong crumbles when you find the courage to set boundaries and make difficult choices. The belief that you need others' approval to be worthy crumbles when you discover the unshakable worth that comes from self-acceptance. These dissolving beliefs often create temporary chaos in your internal world. Without the familiar thought patterns and assumptions that once organized your experience, you may feel lost, confused, unable to make decisions or trust your own judgment. This is the liminal space between old and new consciousness, the threshold where transformation occurs. Learning to tolerate this uncertainty without rushing to create new rigid structures is one of the most important skills of the awakening process. The crumbling may also reveal how many of your life choices were made from fear rather than love. Fear of being alone, Fear of disappointing others, fear of failure, fear of success, fear of being seen as selfish, demanding, or too much. As these fear-based structures collapse, you begin to glimpse what becomes possible when choices are made from love. Love for yourself, for life, for truth, for the full expression of your authentic nature. Sometimes the crumbling happens all at once, in a cascade of simultaneous dissolution that leaves you feeling as though your entire world has exploded. More often it happens in waves, with periods of intense dissolution, followed by periods of apparent stability, only to have another wave of crumbling begin just when you thought you had found solid ground. Learning to surf these waves rather than being destroyed by them becomes part of your initiation into a new way of being. The process often involves what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to create new syntheses from apparently irreconcilable opposites. As old structures crumble, your psyche is working to create new forms that can hold both your need for security and your call to authenticity. Both your desire for relationship and your commitment to selfhood, both your care for others and your responsibility to yourself. The crumbling teaches you about impermanence, the Buddhist understanding that all forms are temporary, that clinging to any external structure as the source of your security is ultimately futile. You learn to find your stability, not in external arrangements that can change or disappear, but in your connection to your own authentic center, your own inner knowing, your own unshakable essence. As the false foundations dissolve, you may discover that what you thought was solid ground was actually quicksand, and what you dismissed as unstable, your intuition, your authentic desires, your inner guidance, is actually bedrock. You learn to trust the ground of your own being rather than looking for security in external structures that require you to abandon yourself to maintain them. The crumbling phase often brings with it a profound loneliness as old connections dissolve, and new ones have not yet formed. You may feel as though you are walking through a wasteland, separated from everyone you once knew, unable to return to old ways of being, but not yet arrived at new ways of connecting. This loneliness is the price of authenticity, the necessary solitude that allows you to discover who you are when you are not trying to be who others need you to be. But within this loneliness lies the seed of true relationship, the capacity to connect with others as your authentic self rather than as a performance of acceptability. When you no longer need relationships to validate your worth or define your identity, you become free to choose connections that genuinely nourish your soul and support your growth. The relationships that survive the crumbling are transformed by it, deepened by the honesty that authenticity requires. The crumbling of false foundations is not punishment, but liberation, not failure, but the clearing away of obstacles to your true success. Every structure that collapses was ultimately too small to contain the woman you are becoming. Every foundation that proves unstable was built on compromise rather than truth. Every system that cannot adapt to your authenticity was never worthy of your participation in the first place. As the dust settles from the great crumbling, you begin to see that what felt like destruction was actually renovation, the necessary demolition that precedes the building of something far more beautiful and substantial than what came before. You are being prepared for a life built on the unshakable foundation of self-knowledge, relationships based on authentic recognition, and work that expresses your true gifts in service of what you genuinely value. This is part of the dangerous power she discovers the moment she knows herself, the power to let go of everything that requires her self-betrayal, the power to choose dissolution over diminishment, the power to trust that what is authentically hers cannot be lost in the crumbling, and what is lost was never truly hers to begin with. In the aftermath of seeing comes the great undoing. There, is a moment in every soul's journey when the foundations upon which an entire life has been built begin to crack like ice beneath the weight of awakening. What once seemed solid, permanent, unquestionable, the very bedrock of identity, reveals itself to be nothing more than sandcastles built at the edge of an incoming tide. This is not gradual erosion, this is catastrophe. This is the lightning strike that splits the ancient oak, the earthquake that topples towers, the flood that washes away everything familiar, leaving only the essential question, who am I when everything I thought I was dissolves? She stands now in the ruins of her former life, watching the slow-motion collapse of every structure that once defined her. The relationships that seemed so vital, so necessary to her survival, expose their secret architecture, built not on love but on mutual unconsciousness, not on authentic meeting, but on the desperate dance of projection and shadow play. The roles she wore like armor, daughter, wife, mother, professional friend, begin to feel like costumes from someone else's play, ill-fitting garments that constrict her breathing and limit her movement. This is enantiodromia, Jung's profound recognition that every psychological extreme eventually transforms into its opposite. What was once her salvation becomes her prison. What provided security now offers only suffocation. The very patterns that helped her navigate the world, the adaptive mechanisms that allowed her to survive and even thrive, reveal their shadow side, the ways they kept her small, acceptable, predictable, the ways they prevented her from becoming fully herself. The marriage that once felt like a fairy tale ending now shows its true face. Two wounded children playing house, each desperately trying to get from the other what they could never give themselves. She sees how she shaped herself to fit his expectations, how she abandoned her own needs to maintain the illusion of harmony, how she made herself smaller and smaller until she nearly disappeared altogether. The love she thought she felt was often fear disguised, fear of abandonment, fear of conflict, fear of standing alone in her own truth. The friendships that seemed so supportive reveal their conditional nature. She realizes how many of her connections were built on shared complaints, mutual enabling, the comfortable conspiracy of remaining unconscious together. When she begins to change, to question, to grow beyond the familiar patterns, some friends retreat as if she has become a stranger. Others actively resist her transformation, sensing that her evolution threatens their own carefully maintained stasis. The social circles that once embraced her now feel like cages, filled with the exhausting performance of being who she used to be. Even her family relationships crack under the pressure of her emerging authenticity. The daughter role that once felt natural now feels like a straitjacket. She sees how her parents' unprocessed trauma shaped her into their ideal child, not the child she actually was, but the child they needed her to be to avoid confronting their own pain. The family dynamics that seem normal reveal themselves as intricate systems designed to maintain everyone's unconsciousness, to keep everyone playing their assigned roles regardless of the cost to their individual souls. Her professional identity crumbles like a facade. The career that once brought pride and external validation now feels empty, meaningless, a betrayal of her deepest values. She recognizes how she learned to perform competence, to play the games required for success, to suppress her intuition and creativity in service of what others deemed acceptable. The ladder she climbed with such determination leads nowhere she actually wants to be. But perhaps most devastating is the collapse of her internal structures, the beliefs about herself that have guided her choices for decades. The good girl, who always put others first, who never rocked the boat, who derived her worth from being needed, wanted, approved of. This identity feels suddenly foreign, like clothes that no longer fit after a dramatic weight loss. She cannot squeeze herself back into these old patterns no matter how hard she tries, and yet without them, who is she? The terror is real and profound. To lose one's foundations is to experience a kind of psychological death, a dissolution of everything that felt permanent and real. She finds herself in free fall, grasping for familiar handholds that crumble at her touch. The ground beneath her feet has turned to quicksand, and every movement seems to pull her deeper into uncertainty. Yet within this terror lives something else, a fierce exhilaration, a dangerous freedom. For the first time in her adult life, she is not performing for anyone, not managing anyone's emotions, not maintaining anyone's comfort, not protecting anyone from their own consequences. In the space left by the collapse of false foundations, something true has room to breathe. She begins to understand that what is crumbling was never truly hers to begin with. These were borrowed identities, inherited patterns, unconscious adaptations to a world that demanded she be anything other than herself. The relationships that cannot survive her authenticity were built on her inauthenticity, and therefore were never real relationships at all. The roles that feel constricting were always prisons, even when she called them home. The dissolution is not random destruction, but purposeful deconstruction. Like a building that must be torn down before a new one can be built on the same site. Her psyche is clearing space for something unprecedented, a life lived from the inside out rather than the outside in. A way of being that honors her own nature rather than betraying it for the comfort of others. She watches friends who are still asleep, still performing their unconscious roles with dedication and exhaustion. She feels both compassion and alienation. How can she explain that the life they think she has lost was never truly life at all? How can she describe the terrifying freedom of no longer knowing who she is supposed to be? They see her choices as self-destruction, but she knows them as self-construction, the first honest construction she has ever attempted. The old securities reveal themselves as sophisticated forms of imprisonment, the predictable relationship that demanded she eclipse her own needs, the social group that required her to gossip and complain rather than create and inspire, the family role that asked her to remain a child forever, never fully claiming her own authority, the professional path that rewarded conformity over innovation, politics over authenticity. Each crumbling structure teaches her something about the difference between true security and false security. False security comes from external validation, from fitting in, from avoiding conflict, from being what others need her to be. True security can only come from inner alignment, from the unshakable foundation of self-knowledge, from the courage to be disliked for being real rather than loved. For being fake, the process is not clean or linear. Some days she mourns the loss of her old life with genuine grief. The simplicity of unconsciousness had its own beauty. There was comfort in the familiar patterns, even when they were slowly killing her spirit. There was ease in knowing exactly what was expected, even when meeting those expectations meant abandoning herself. But there is no return. Once consciousness has dawned, unconsciousness becomes impossible. Once authenticity has been tasted, performance becomes unbearable. Once the cage door has been opened, the bird cannot pretend it doesn't see the sky. The crumbling continues in waves, each new layer of awareness bringing its own small apocalypse. She discovers patterns within patterns, unconscious agreements she made so long ago she had forgotten they were agreements rather than eternal truths. Ways she learned to betray herself so subtly, so consistently, that the betrayal felt like loyalty, money, status, appearance, achievement. All the external markers of success that once motivated her now feel hollow. Not because these things are inherently meaningless, but because she pursued them for the wrong reasons. She sought financial security not from a place of empowerment, but from a place of fear. She chased status not from authentic ambition, but from the desperate need to prove her worth to those who would never truly see her. She managed her appearance not from self-love, but from the exhausting attempt to control how others perceived and therefore treated her. Even her spiritual seeking reveals its shadow. She recognizes how she used meditation to escape rather than integrate, how she pursued enlightenment as another form of perfectionism, another way to be special, another method of avoiding the messy reality of being human, how she turned her healing journey into another performance, another way to be the good student, the star patient, the most evolved person in the room. The crumbling of false foundations is not punishment, but liberation. It is the psyche's immune system, finally, rejecting what was never meant to be integrated. Like a body expelling a toxic substance, her consciousness is purging everything that is not truly hers, everything that serves someone else's agenda for her life, rather than her own soul's deepest knowing. She learns to find strange comfort in the uncertainty. Not knowing who she's supposed to be creates space for discovering who she actually is. Not having predetermined roles to fill allows her to respond to each moment freshly, authentically, creatively. The absence of external validation forces her to develop internal validation, the most reliable source of security she has ever known. The loneliness is real, but different from the loneliness she experienced while surrounded by people who didn't really know her. This is clean loneliness, honest loneliness, the temporary isolation that comes from growing beyond one's former community, rather than the chronic alienation that comes from hiding one's truth. She prefers this authentic solitude to the performance of connection that characterized so many of her former relationships. Some structures will be rebuilt on stronger foundations. Some relationships will survive the earthquake of her transformation, emerging deeper and more real. Some aspects of her professional life will find new expression aligned with her values. But nothing will ever be the same. She has tasted freedom, and there is no returning to voluntary imprisonment. The old her would have seen this crumbling as failure. The emerging her recognizes it as the most necessary success of her lifetime. Every false structure that collapses makes room for something true to grow. Every inauthentic relationship that ends makes space for authentic connection to flourish. Every role that no longer fits creates an opening for her genuine self to emerge. In the rubble of her former life, she finds unexpected treasures, aspects of herself that were buried beneath years of unconscious adaptation. Creative impulses that were suppressed for being too impractical. Emotional truths that were denied for being too inconvenient. Intuitive knowings that were dismissed for being too irrational. Dreams that were abandoned for being too unrealistic. The great crumbling is also a great revealing. As the false structures collapse, what remains is what was always true, always essential, always indestructible. Not the ego's constructions, but the self's eternal presence. Not who she learned to be, but who she has always been beneath all the learning, all the adaptation, all the unconscious compromises. She stands in the ruins of her former life and knows that this destruction is the most creative act she has ever accomplished. For only in the complete dissolution of what was false can what is true finally be born. Only in the courage to lose everything can she discover that what she truly is can never be lost at all. The foundations crumble, and she learns to dance in the debris. This is not an ending, but a beginning. The first, honest beginning of her life. The lightning that strikes the towers also illuminates the sky, showing her a vast expanse of possibility she never knew existed when she was trapped in rooms too small for her expanding soul. In the wilderness of her own becoming, she crosses the threshold into hermit's territory, that sacred landscape where the soul learns to keep its own company without apology or explanation. This is not the hermitage of defeat, not the withdrawal of those who have been wounded beyond repair by the world's casual cruelties. This is the chosen solitude of the initiated, the deliberate retreat of one who has discovered that the most profound conversations happen in silence, that the deepest intimacy occurs when there is no other present to distract from the eternal dialogue between consciousness and its source. She has entered the cave of her own making, carved from years of saying no to what diminished her and yes to what remained mysterious even to herself. Here, in this sanctuary, beyond the reach of others' projections and expectations, she begins the dangerous art of self-companionship, dangerous because once mastered, it renders her immune to the manipulations of loneliness, the seductions of codependency, the desperate compromises born from the fear of being alone. The world calls this isolation, pathologizes this choice, warns of the perils of too much introspection. But she has learned to distinguish between the loneliness that wounds and the solitude that heals. Loneliness is the ache of disconnection from others. Solitude is the joy of connection with oneself. Loneliness is empty space that echoes with absence. Solitude is full space that resonates with presence. She has traded the former for the latter and knows she has made the most intelligent bargain of her life. In this hermit's cave, away from the constant noise of others' needs and opinions, she hears for the first time the sound of her own voice. Not the voice that learned to please, to soothe, to explain, to justify, but the voice that knows without learning, that speaks from some deep well of truth that has been waiting through decades for this moment of uninterrupted audience. The silence here is not empty, but textured, layered, alive with subtle intelligence. It speaks in the language of intuition, in the grammar of dreams, in the poetry of bodily sensation and emotional truth. She learns to read these subtler communications, to trust the wisdom that arises not from analysis, but from some deeper intelligence that knows things her rational mind has never been taught. This is where she discovers that being alone and being lonely are as different as thirst and drinking. She has spent so many years afraid of her own company, convinced that without others, to reflect back some version of acceptability, she would discover herself to be fundamentally unlovable, essentially flawed, inherently broken. But in the sustained encounter with herself that only solitude allows, she finds instead a being of surprising complexity, unexpected beauty, profound wisdom. The hermit's cave becomes her laboratory for authenticity, the place where she can experiment with being exactly who she is without audience or consequence. Here she can cry without explaining her tears, laugh without moderating her joy, rage without protecting others from her anger, love without diminishing her radiance to make others comfortable. Here she can be too much, too little, too intense, too quiet, too anything, because there is no one to be too much for except herself, and herself, she discovers, has infinite capacity for her own experience. She learns the radical practice of self-witnessing, becoming both the observer and the observed, the lover and the beloved, the mother and the child. This is not narcissism, but its opposite. The end of the desperate search for validation through others' eyes, and the beginning of genuine self-regard that comes from truly seeing oneself with compassion and clarity. In this solitude, she excavates the layers of conditioning that accumulated like sediment over the authentic self. She discovers beliefs about her worthiness that were never hers, fears that were inherited rather than earned, dreams that were abandoned not because they were impossible, but because they were inconvenient for others. Layer by layer, she peels away what was added and returns to what was always there. The essential self that existed before the world taught her to be someone else. The hermit's cave becomes a place of intense creativity, where, freed from the need to explain or justify her interests, she can follow the golden thread of curiosity wherever it leads. She paints not for exhibition, but for expression. She writes not for publication, but for understanding. She dances not for performance, but for the sheer joy of moving in rhythm with her own inner music. This creativity is not productive in any conventional sense. It is generative in the deepest sense, giving birth to aspects of herself that could only emerge in the safety of solitude. Here she practices the lost art of doing nothing productive, of being without performing, of existing without justifying. Her existence through achievement or service or entertainment, she learns to inhabit time differently, not as a resource to be managed, but as a medium to be explored. Minutes expand into hours as she follows a single thought to its source, as she watches light move across her wall, as she listens to the subtle sounds her body makes when it is truly relaxed. The hermit's solitude teaches her about presence, not the forced mindfulness she once practiced as another form of self-improvement, but the natural presence that emerges when there is nowhere else to be, nothing else to do, no one else to become. This presence has weight and substance. It is not the absence of something, but the fullness of being completely here with whatever is arising. She discovers that her own company is not boring, but endlessly fascinating. The inner landscape she explores in solitude has the complexity of entire worlds. Her emotions reveal themselves to have color, texture, movement, intelligence. Her thoughts show their origins, their patterns, their power to create reality. Her body becomes a trusted advisor, speaking in the language of sensation and instinct, offering guidance that is more reliable than any external authority. In the sustained silence, she begins to hear the voice of what Jung called the self. Not the ego's constant chatter, but the deeper intelligence that orchestrates her dreams, that knows what she needs before she asks, that guides her toward experiences necessary for her growth, even when they are not what her personality prefers. This voice speaks not in words but in knowings, not in commands but in invitations, not in shoulds but in gentle offerings of possibility. The hermit's cave becomes a place of healing, not through any deliberate practice, but through the simple act of being witnessed by herself with complete acceptance. Here she can feel her feelings fully, without having to manage their impact on others. She can explore her darkness without being warned away from it. She can celebrate her light without dimming it to protect others' comfort. This self-witnessing has a magical quality. What is fully experienced in solitude often transforms spontaneously, not through effort, but through the alchemy of unconditional awareness. She learns to distinguish between the voice of wisdom and the voice of conditioning, between the impulse that serves her growth and the impulse that serves her fear. In solitude, without the constant input of others' agendas, she develops what could be called an internal compass, a reliable sense of what moves her toward wholeness and what moves her toward fragmentation. The world outside continues with its demands and dramas, but from the hermit's cave it appears differently, not as the source of her happiness or unhappiness, but as a reflection of the inner dynamics she is learning to understand. She sees how her previous relationships were often external enactments of internal conflicts, how the people who triggered her most were showing her aspects of herself she had not yet learned to love. This recognition transforms her relationship to conflict and difficulty. Rather than seeing problems as interruptions to her peace, she begins to recognize them as invitations to deeper self-knowledge. Rather than trying to fix or change the external world, she focuses on understanding and integrating the internal world, knowing that outer transformation follows naturally from inner transformation. The hermit's solitude is not passive withdrawal. but active engagement with the most interesting conversation partner she has ever encountered, herself. She discovers that she is funny, wise, creative, profound, mysterious, surprising. She finds that her own thoughts and feelings and observations are endlessly compelling when she gives them the kind of attention she once reserved only for others. She learns to be her own best friend, her most trusted advisor, her most loyal companion. This is not selfish but essential, for only when she has learned to truly love her own company can she offer genuine love to others. Only when she has stopped abandoning herself can she be trusted not to abandon others. Only when she has learned to meet her own needs can she serve others from overflow rather than depletion. The hermit's cave reveals itself to be not a place of isolation, but of the deepest connection with the source of life that flows through her, with the intelligence that created her, with the love that sustains her. This connection was always there, but it could only be discovered in the silence that comes when all other connections are temporarily set aside. In this sacred solitude, she experiences what the mystics have always known, that the beloved we seek in relationships exists first within us, that the home we search for in the world must first be found in our own hearts, that the acceptance we crave from others can only be genuinely received when we have learned to accept ourselves completely. She discovers that solitude is not preparation for relationship, but the foundation of all authentic relationship. For only when she has learned to be whole alone can she enter partnership without the desperate need to be completed by another. Only when she has learned to love herself unconditionally can she love others without the secret agenda of earning love in return. The hermit's cave teaches her about sovereignty, not the cold independence that keeps others at bay, but the warm self-sufficiency that makes genuine intimacy possible. She learns the difference between needing others and enjoying others, between seeking completion through others and sharing completion with others. As her time in hermit solitude deepens, she begins to understand that this withdrawal from the world is not an ending, but a beginning. She is not becoming antisocial, but authentically social, learning to relate from truth rather than need, from fullness rather than emptiness, from choice rather than compulsion. The world will look different when she emerges from this cave, not because the world has changed, but because she has developed new eyes. She will recognize the difference between people who want to know her and people who want to use her, between relationships that nourish her authenticity and relationships that require her to perform. She will be able to give from abundance rather than obligation, to receive without debt or guilt, to love without losing herself. But for now, she remains in the hermit's sacred solitude, learning the most essential skill of human existence, how to be genuinely, completely, joyfully at home with herself. This is not exile, but return, not loneliness, but completion, not withdrawal from life, but the deepest possible engagement with the source from which all life flows. In the silence of the cave, she hears the sound of her own becoming, the quiet music of transformation that can only be heard when all other noise falls away. This is the hermit's gift, not isolation from love, but intimate knowledge of love's true source, not separation from others, but preparation for the deepest possible meeting, not withdrawal from the world, but the discovery of the world that has always existed within her, waiting for this moment of recognition, this homecoming to herself. In the deepest chamber of her solitude, where silence has taught her its most intimate secrets, she encounters the presence she has been unconsciously seeking through every relationship, every romance, every desperate attempt to find completion in another's arms. Here, in the sacred darkness of her own becoming, she meets the animus, not as Jung's abstract concept, but as living presence, the divine masculine that has been waiting through lifetimes for this moment of conscious recognition. This is not the wounded masculine she has known in the outer world, not the men who could not meet her depth, who feared her power, who needed her to be smaller to feel bigger themselves. This is not the shadow masculine that dominates or abandons, that competes or withdraws, that promises what it cannot deliver and delivers what was never promised. This inner beloved carries none of the conditioning, none of the fear, none of the unconscious patterns that have made relationship in the outer world such a treacherous landscape of projection and disappointment. The meeting happens not as event, but as recognition, not as encounter, but as remembering. She realizes he has always been there, in the part of her that knows how to act with clarity and purpose, in the aspect that can make decisions without endless deliberation, in the energy that drives her toward her goals with unwavering focus. But she had projected these qualities outward, seeking them in partners rather than claiming them as aspects of her own wholeness. This inner masculine appears to her not as conqueror, but as protector, not as ruler, but as guardian of her sacred flame. He carries the sword that cuts through illusion, the shield that defends her truth, the compass that points always toward her authentic path. He is fierce without being violent, strong without being dominating, directive without being controlling. He honors her sovereignty, not because he has been taught to, but because her sovereignty is the very air he breathes. In his presence, she understands for the first time what it means to be truly met. Not the surface meeting of personality matching personality, but the soul recognition of essential equals engaging in the eternal dance of consciousness, exploring itself through relationship. He sees her not as she appears, but as she is, infinite, eternal, sacred, whole. His gaze does not diminish her light, but amplifies it, does not possess her beauty, but celebrates it. The hieros gamos begins, the sacred marriage that occurs not at the altar of external ceremony, but in the temple of the integrated psyche. This is the alchemical wedding that transforms both bride and groom into something neither could become alone. She does not lose herself in this union, but finds herself more completely than ever before. He does not complete her, because she was never incomplete. But he dances with her wholeness in a way that reveals new dimensions of what wholeness can be. This inner beloved knows how to hold space for her deepest emotions without trying to fix or change them. When she rages, he does not flee or fight back, but stands firm as witness, honoring the sacred fire of her anger. When she grieves, he does not rush to comfort, but allows her tears their full expression, understanding that some things must be fully felt to be fully healed. When she celebrates, he does not diminish her joy with practical concerns, but amplifies it with his own delight in her radiance. He speaks to her in the language of dreams, in synchronicities that feel like love letters from the universe, in the sudden knowing that arises when she faces important decisions. His voice is not the harsh critic that has dominated her inner dialogue, but the wise counselor who helps her see situations clearly, who reminds her of her own power when she has forgotten it, who encourages her to trust the deep wisdom that flows through her feminine intuition. This animus does not need her to be anything other than exactly what she is. He does not require her to be less emotional to spare his comfort, less powerful to protect his ego, less authentic to maintain his illusions. In fact, the more fully herself she becomes, the more radiant their connection grows. Her authenticity is not threat to him, but invitation, not competition, but collaboration in the great work of becoming whole. She learns the difference between seeking completion through relationship and sharing completion in relationship. The external partners she had chosen carried her projections of the qualities she had not yet claimed in herself. She sought in them the strength she had not developed, the clarity she had not cultivated, the purpose she had not discovered. But this inner beloved reveals that these qualities were always hers to embody, always aspects of her own multifaceted nature, waiting for conscious integration. In the sacred marriage of anima and animus, she experiences what it means to be both receptive and active, both yielding and directing, both mysterious and clear. She no longer needs to choose between her feminine and masculine aspects, but can dance fluidly between them as the moment requires. She can be soft without being weak, strong without being hard, receptive without being passive, active without being aggressive. The inner beloved teaches her about healthy boundaries, not walls built from fear, but membranes that allow authentic connection while preserving essential selfhood. He shows her how to say no from love rather than anger, how to say yes from choice rather than obligation. In his presence, she learns that true intimacy requires not the dissolution of boundaries, but their conscious, mutual, temporary lowering between sovereign beings who choose to share their inner worlds. This divine masculine within her carries the energy of purpose and direction that does not override her intuitive knowing, but serves it faithfully. He helps her translate the whispers of her feminine wisdom into concrete action in the world. He builds the structures that can hold her visions, creates the forms that can express her inspirations, manifests in reality what she perceives in the realm of possibility. She realizes that all her external relationships were training for this. Internal union. Every man who disappointed her was teaching her what she truly needed. Every partnership that failed was showing her the qualities she had not yet developed in herself. Every heartbreak was breaking her open to discover the unbreakable love that exists at her core. She feels grateful now for all the men who could not love her as she deserved, for they forced her to discover the one who could, the eternal masculine that lives within her own soul. The inner beloved does not demand exclusive relationship, but enhances her capacity for all relationships. From the foundation of this inner union, she can meet others without the desperate need for them to be other than they are. She can appreciate their gifts without needing them to fill her gaps, enjoy their company without requiring their validation, love them without losing herself. This sacred marriage transforms her relationship to sexuality, revealing it to be not merely physical pleasure, but spiritual communion, not conquest or surrender, but mutual recognition of the divine spark that animates all life. In the union of her inner masculine and feminine, she discovers that the deepest ecstasy comes not from external stimulation, but from the internal harmony of all aspects of herself dancing together in perfect rhythm. She understands now why no external partner could ever satisfy the deep longing she carried. That longing was not for another person, but for this internal integration, not for external love, but for the recognition of the love that she is. The beloved she sought in others was always, and only the beloved she was meant to discover within herself, not as consolation prize for failed relationships, but as the greatest prize of conscious evolution. The animus reveals to her the sacred purpose that has been calling her throughout her life, not the purpose imposed by external authorities, but the mission that emerges from the marriage of her deepest knowing and her clearest action. He helps her understand that her healing journey was never just personal, but preparation for service, that her individual wholeness is meant to be shared with a world hungry for authentic models of integration. In the presence of this inner beloved, she learns to trust the masculine aspect of her nature that can make decisions quickly and clearly, that can set boundaries without guilt, that can pursue goals with unwavering focus. She no longer sees these qualities as betrayals of her feminine nature, but as essential aspects of her complete human nature. The divine masculine within her serves the divine feminine within her, and together they create a wholeness greater than either could achieve alone. This sacred marriage is not a one-time event, but an ongoing relationship that deepens through conscious attention and honored in daily life. She learns to check in with this inner beloved when facing important decisions, to feel his supportive presence when she needs courage, to trust his protective instincts when she encounters situations that require clear boundaries. The integration of the animus marks the end of her unconscious attraction to unavailable, wounded, or incompatible partners. She can no longer be seduced by potential or excited by drama, for she has found in herself the stable, available, deeply compatible partner she was always seeking. This does not make her less interested in external relationship, but more discerning about the quality of relationship she will accept. She realizes that the inner beloved is not possessive or jealous of her external relationships, but serves as wise counselor in navigating them. He helps her recognize when others are projecting onto her, when she is projecting onto others, when a relationship is mutual and when it is one-sided. His presence within her makes her immune to manipulation and deception, for she can no longer be convinced to betray her own knowing. From the foundation of this inner union, she can engage with the world from a place of fullness rather than seeking, of giving rather than getting, of loving rather than needing to be loved. She becomes dangerous to the status quo of unconscious relationship, for she models something that most people have never seen, a human being who is complete unto herself and therefore free to love without agenda, to relate without attachment, to share without depletion. The sacred marriage within transforms her into what Jung called the transcendent function, the bridge between opposites, the mediator between conscious and unconscious, the one who can hold paradox without needing to resolve it into false simplicity. She becomes living proof that what we seek in others exists within us, that what we need from the world can be generated from our own depths, that the beloved we long for is, and always was, our own deepest self, meeting us in the sacred chamber of conscious solitude. In this inner union, she discovers the secret that mystics and lovers have always known, that separation is illusion, that love is not something we find, but something we are, that the greatest romance is not between two people, but between consciousness and itself, playing eternally at the game of forgetting and remembering its own divine nature through the mirror of relationship, through the sacred pressure of conscious suffering and the alchemical heat of inner work, sustained across seasons of transformation. Something unprecedented emerges from the crucible of her becoming. The coal of her former identity, compressed by the weight of authentic living, heated by the friction of choosing truth over comfort, transforms into diamond. Not the diamond of metaphor, but the actual crystalline clarity of a consciousness that has been purified by its willingness to face everything, reject nothing, and integrate all. This is the birth of the self, not the ego's grandiose inflation, but the archetype of wholeness that transcends every partial identity she has ever worn. She emerges from the cocoon of her dissolving, not as the sum of her parts, but as something entirely new, carrying within her the dangerous power of complete authenticity, the power that makes others uncomfortable, not because it is aggressive, but because it is so purely itself that it exposes by contrast how much of life most people spend pretending to be someone else. The diamond self is unbreakable, not because it is hard, but because it is integrated. Every facet of her being, the light and shadow, the strength and vulnerability, the wisdom and uncertainty, has been consciously claimed and woven into a wholeness that cannot be diminished by external circumstances. She has learned to love her own complexity with such thoroughness that criticism bounces off like rain on stone, not because she is defended, but because she has already seen and accepted everything critics might point out. This Birth is violent in the way all authentic births are violent, the bursting forth of new life that cannot be contained by previous forms. The personality that served her for decades cracks open like an egg, revealing something magnificent and unprecedented that was always growing in the darkness. She mourns the loss of her familiar self, even as she celebrates the emergence of this being she barely recognizes yet knows more intimately than she has ever known anything. The diamond self carries multifaceted brilliance. From one angle, she appears as the wise woman who has integrated her shadow so completely that darkness and light dance together in her presence. From another, she is the fierce protector who will not tolerate abuse of herself or others, who has learned to wield boundaries like sacred weapons. From yet another facet, she is the compassionate healer whose wounds have become sources of wisdom, whose brokenness has been transformed into breakthrough. She discovers that wholeness does not mean perfection, but integration. The diamond self contains every contradiction, every paradox, every seemingly incompatible aspect of human nature, held in conscious tension rather than unconscious conflict. She is both strong and tender, both independent and connected, both grounded and mystical. These are not problems to be solved, but mysteries to be embodied, not conflicts to be resolved, but creative tensions that generate the energy of authentic living. The birth of the self marks the end of her susceptibility to external validation or invalidation, not because she no longer cares what others think, but because she has developed an internal reference point so reliable that external opinions become simply information rather than verdicts on her worth. She can hear feedback without it destroying her, receive praise without it inflating her, encounter disapproval without it diminishing her. She has become unmanipulatable, uncontrollable, undimeable. This inner diamond refracts light in ways that reveal the hidden rainbows in ordinary moments. Her perception has been so clarified by the work of integration that she sees beauty where others see only mundane reality, recognizes sacred patterns where others experience only chaos, finds meaning in experiences that would overwhelm or depress. Those who have not done the work of becoming whole, the dangerous power she now carries is the power of radical authenticity in a world addicted to performance. She speaks truth not to shock or rebel, but because lies have become physically impossible for her to maintain. Her system has been so purified by the commitment to self-honesty that deception of any kind creates immediate internal discord. She has become allergic to inauthenticity in herself and increasingly intolerant of it in others. People respond to her presence in ways that reveal their own relationship to truth. Those who are committed to their own growth feel inspired and energized by her example. Those who are invested in remaining unconscious feel threatened and may attack or withdraw. Children and animals recognize her immediately as safe, sensing the absence of hidden agendas or suppressed emotions. She has become transparent in the most literal sense. What you see is what you get. What she says is what she means. What she feels is what she expresses. The diamond self has learned to live from essence rather than circumstance. External conditions may change. Relationships may end, jobs may disappear, health may fluctuate, but her core remains unshakable because it is no longer dependent on anything outside herself for its stability. She has found the eye of the hurricane within her own being, the place of perfect stillness that exists regardless of the chaos swirling around her. This birth transforms her relationship to time and mortality. Having died and been reborn while still alive, she no longer fears death because she has already experienced the ultimate death, the death of who she thought she was. What remains is what was always deathless, always eternal, always beyond the reach of time's transformations. She lives with the urgency of someone who knows that every moment is precious precisely because it is temporary, and with the peace of someone who knows that what she truly is can never be lost. The integrated self expresses itself as fierce compassion. Compassion that does not enable or codepend, but sees clearly and responds appropriately. She can feel genuine love for someone, while refusing to participate in their unconscious patterns. She can offer support without taking responsibility for others' choices. She can care deeply without carrying others' burdens. Her love has become pure because it is no longer contaminated by need, guilt, or the compulsion to fix or save. She recognizes now that her years of suffering were not punishment, but preparation. Not evidence of her brokenness, but the necessary pressure that created this diamond clarity. Every betrayal taught her to trust herself more deeply. Every loss revealed what could never be taken away. Every moment of despair was actually a moment of the false self dying, so the true self could be born. The world looks different through diamond eyes. She sees through the collective pretense that passes for normal life, the way people sacrifice their authenticity for acceptance, their joy for security, their truth for approval. She feels both sadness and compassion for this mass sleepwalking, remembering when she too lived in that twilight state between unconsciousness and awakening. Her presence becomes a mirror that reflects others' authenticity or lack thereof back to them. Some people are drawn to this mirror because they are ready to see themselves clearly. Others are repelled because they are not yet ready for that level of self-confrontation. She learns to accept both responses without taking them personally, understanding that readiness for truth cannot be forced or manufactured. The diamond self radiates a particular quality of power, not power over others, but power to be herself, completely regardless of external pressure to be otherwise. This is the power that dictators fear, that unconscious systems cannot tolerate, that sleeping people find either inspiring or threatening. She has become ungovernable by anyone except her own deepest wisdom. Her creativity flows from this diamond clarity like light refracting through crystal. Everything she touches becomes more beautiful, more real, more alive, because she is engaging with it from a place of complete presence rather than partial attention. Her work in the world, whatever form it takes, carries the frequency of integration, helping others remember their own capacity for wholeness. The birth of the self marks the beginning of true service, not service from guilt or obligation or the need to be needed, but service from overflow, from the natural expression of love that has no object and needs no recipient to be complete. She serves because love serves, because wholeness naturally seeks to share itself, because the diamond of her consciousness cannot help but cast rainbow light wherever it goes. She has become what Jung called the individuated person, not selfish but selfed, not egotistical but authentic, not perfect but whole. She carries within her being proof that the journey from unconsciousness to consciousness is possible, that suffering can be transformed into wisdom, that every human being contains the capacity for this same diamond transformation. The birth is complete, yet it is also beginning. For the diamond self is not a destination, but a way of being, not an achievement, but a living process. She must learn to embody this wholeness in relationships, to express this authenticity in service, to share this diamond clarity with a world that desperately needs models of what integrated humanity looks like. She stands now as living contradiction to the story that we are broken and need fixing, that we are incomplete and need others to complete us, that we are powerless and need external authorities to guide us. She is dangerous to every system built on human unconsciousness, beautiful to every soul ready for its own awakening, and utterly, completely, magnificently herself. The diamond catches light and throws rainbows across the walls of existence, reminding all who see it that they too carry this same potential for brilliance, this same capacity for transformation, this same birthright of wholeness that no amount of conditioning can ever truly destroy. She has become what she was always meant to be, not perfect but perfectly herself, not without shadow but conscious of her shadow, not beyond human, but fully human in a way that most humans have forgotten is possible. This is the birth of the diamond self, forged in the fires of conscious suffering and polished by the sustained commitment to truth over comfort, authenticity, over acceptance, wholeness over the familiar fragments of partial living. She shines now not to blind others, but to remind them of their own light, not to stand above, but to call others home to themselves, not to end the journey, but to begin it from a foundation of unshakable self-knowledge and diamond-clear purpose. From the ashes of her former accommodating self rises a figure both terrible and magnificent, the warrior queen of her own existence. No longer does she bend herself into shapes that please others at the cost of her own soul. No longer does she twist her truth into palatable lies to spare the world the discomfort of her authenticity. The woman who has descended into her depths and claimed her dangerous power emerges wielding the most fearsome weapon in her arsenal, the sacred art of discernment. To the holy practice of boundaries. This is not the brittle defensiveness of the wounded ego, building walls to keep the world at bay. This is something far more profound and infinitely more threatening to those who would seek to control or diminish her. This is the unshakable sovereignty of a soul that has come to know its own worth. She has learned to distinguish between what belongs to her and what belongs to others, between what serves her growth and what drains her essence, between the voices that call her forward and the ones that would pull her back into the comfortable. A prison of who she used to be, the sword she wields is forged from her own inner fire, tempered by the tears she has shed in service of her awakening, sharpened by every boundary she has learned to draw with trembling hands that grew steadier with each sacred no she spoke into existence. This sword cuts through illusion with precision, severing the energetic cords that once bound her to others' expectations, others' needs, others' unconscious demands for her diminishment. She discovers that boundaries are not walls, but thresholds, sacred, spaces where she gets to choose what enters her energetic field and what must remain outside. Each boundary she sets is an act of self-love, a declaration of her inherent worth, a recognition that her energy is precious currency that must be spent consciously rather than squandered unconsciously on every demand that presents itself wearing the mask of obligation or guilt. The no that rises from her depths carries the authority of a woman who has learned the true cost of unconscious accommodation. She remembers the years she spent saying yes when every cell in her body screamed no, the countless moments she betrayed her own truth to maintain the comfort of others, the slow erosion of her authentic self that occurred each time she chose peace over truth, harmony over honesty, others' approval over her own self-respect. But this remembering does not fill her with bitterness. It fills her with fierce determination never to abandon herself again. Each no she speaks is a reclamation of energy previously scattered to the four winds of others' expectations. Each boundary she establishes is a restoration of the sovereignty she never knew she had possessed all along. Each time she honors her own truth over others' comfort, she stakes a claim in the territory of her authentic existence. The warrior queen understands that her boundaries are not punishments inflicted upon those who would breach them, but gifts offered to a world that has forgotten the art of respectful relating. When she says no to what does not align with her values, she creates space for what does. When she refuses to participate in dynamics that require her self-betrayal, she models a different way of being in relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than unconscious exploitation. Her boundaries become acts of love, not only toward herself, but toward those who would benefit from learning to relate to her as the whole, authentic being she has become, rather than the fragmented, accommodating persona she once wore. She recognizes that allowing others to treat her badly serves no one. Not them, not her, not the collective evolution toward more conscious ways of living and loving. The fierce yes that accompanies her sacred no carries even more power, for it represents her commitment to honor what truly matters to her. When she says yes to her own dreams, her own values, her own deep knowing of what brings her alive, she aligns herself with the creative force of the universe itself. Her yes becomes a channel through which her authentic power can flow into the world, transforming not only her own life, but creating ripples of possibility for everyone she touches. This yes is dangerous because it is uncompromising in its authenticity. She will not say yes to what diminishes her, no matter how much others need her to diminish herself for their comfort. She will not say yes to relationships that require her to be less than she is, no matter how familiar those patterns might feel. She will not say yes to work that soul-crushes her creativity, no matter how secure the paycheck might be. Her yes has become aligned with her soul's deepest truth, making it impossible for her to participate in anything that requires her to abandon herself. The warrior queen learns that true power lies not in forcing others to respect her boundaries, but in respecting them so completely herself that violation becomes impossible. She does not argue her boundaries or justify them or explain them to those who would challenge them. She simply maintains them with the quiet authority of a woman who knows her own worth and refuses to negotiate it away for any reason whatsoever. When family members accuse her of being selfish for putting her own well-being first, she no longer explains why self-care is necessary for her ability to care for others. When friends guilt her for not being available for their every crisis, she no longer justifies her need for time and space to nurture her own soul. When romantic partners demand access to parts of her that she is not ready or willing to share, she no longer apologizes for her right to privacy and emotional autonomy. The warrior queen has learned that explaining her boundaries to those who are committed to crossing them is like explaining color to someone who chooses to remain blind. Her energy is far too precious to waste on convincing others that she deserves the respect she has learned to give herself. Instead, she simply enforces her boundaries with the calm authority of natural law, as inevitable and unalterable as gravity itself. This enforcement is not violent or vengeful, but it is absolute. When someone crosses a boundary, she has clearly established she does not engage in drama or negotiation. She simply removes herself from the situation, whether physically, emotionally, or energetically. She has learned that her presence is a gift she offers freely, not a right others possess simply by virtue of their connection to her. The sovereignty she embodies threatens every system built on the exploitation of women's tendency to overgive and under-receive. Her refusal to absorb others' emotions challenges family dynamics that have relied on her emotional caretaking. Her insistence on equal reciprocity in relationships disturbs friendships that have been built on her constant giving and others' comfortable taking. Her demand for respect and appreciation in the workplace disrupts professional environments that have benefited from her willingness to do more than her share for less than she deserves. But the warrior queen no longer concerns herself with the comfort of systems that have thrived on her discomfort. She understands that protecting the territory of her authentic self is not selfish, but sacred, a holy act of stewardship for the divine gift of her own existence. She has learned that she cannot serve the world from an empty well, cannot love others authentically while abandoning herself, cannot create positive change while participating in dynamics that require her own diminishment. Her boundaries become a form of activism, a quiet revolution against the unconscious agreements that keep women small, accommodating, and self-sacrificing. Each time she honors her own needs without guilt, she gives permission for other women to do the same. Each time she refuses to accept treatment that does not honor her worth, she raises the standards for how women expect to be treated. Each time she chooses her own authenticity over others' comfort, she contributes to the collective healing of the wounded feminine that has been taught to give until there is nothing left to give. The dangerous power of her boundaries lies in their absolute clarity. There is no negotiation, no manipulation, no passive-aggressive communication that leaves room for interpretation or boundary testing. She speaks her truth with the directness of mountain air, clean and sharp and impossible to misunderstand. When she says no, it is complete. When she says yes, it is wholehearted. When she establishes a limit, it is non-negotiable. This clarity disturbs those who are accustomed to finding ways around other people's boundaries, who are skilled at guilt-tripping and manipulation, who rely on others' confusion and self-doubt to maintain their position of advantage. The warrior queen's boundaries are immune to these tactics because they arise not from her ego's need to control, but from her soul's commitment to honor itself. She has learned to distinguish between the voice of her authentic inner knowing and the voices of internalized guilt, shame, and conditioning that would convince her to betray herself. When guilt arises around setting a boundary, she examines it carefully. Is this the healthy guilt that indicates she has genuinely caused harm? Or is it the toxic guilt that has been programmed into her to keep her compliant and accommodating? More often than not, she discovers that her guilt around boundary setting is actually evidence of how well she has been trained to prioritize others' comfort over her own well-being. The warrior queen knows that guilt is often the price of freedom, that discomfort is the cost of growth, that the temporary pain of disappointing others is infinitely preferable to the chronic pain of disappointing herself. She has learned to breathe through the guilt, to hold space for the discomfort, to trust that her boundaries serve a purpose greater than immediate harmony or universal approval. Her dangerous power manifests in her ability to remain centered in her own truth, regardless of how others respond to it. When family members rage against her new boundaries, she does not apologize or back down. When friends withdraw their friendship because she is no longer willing to overfunction in the relationship, she grieves the loss, but does not compromise her standards. When romantic partners threaten to leave because she will not abandon herself to meet their needs, she chooses the pain of loneliness over the agony of self-betrayal. This is the ultimate expression of her sovereignty, the willingness to stand alone in her truth rather than compromise it for the sake of connection. She has learned that relationships built on her self-abandonment are not true relationships at all, but elaborate forms of self-betrayal disguised as love. She would rather be authentically alone than inauthentically accompanied. The warrior queen understands that her boundaries are not fixed walls, but living systems that evolve as she grows and changes. What she needed to protect in the early stages of her awakening may be different from what she needs to protect now. Some boundaries that once felt essential may soften as she grows stronger in her sense of self. Others may need to become more firm as she learns to value her energy and attention as the sacred resources they are. She practices the art of boundary maintenance with the same dedication she once brought to accommodating others. She regularly checks in with herself. What is working in my relationships? What is draining me? Where am I giving more than I am receiving? Where am I compromising my truth for the sake of harmony? Where do I need to establish clearer limits or stronger protections? This ongoing practice of self-assessment and boundary adjustment becomes a form of spiritual discipline, a way of honoring the sacred responsibility she has to steward her own life force. She recognizes that her energy is not unlimited, Her emotional capacity is not infinite, and her willingness to give must be balanced by her commitment to receive. The warrior queen's boundaries extend beyond her relationships with others to encompass her relationship with herself. She learns to set limits on her own tendency toward self-criticism, to establish boundaries around negative self-talk, to protect herself from the internalized voices that would diminish her worth or question her right to take up space in the world. She becomes fierce in her self-protection, guarding her inner landscape with the same vigilance she once reserved for protecting others' feelings. She will not allow anyone, including herself, to speak to her in ways that dishonor her worth or undermine her progress. She becomes her own most devoted advocate, her own most trusted ally in the ongoing work of living authentically in a world that often rewards conformity over truth. This self-protection is not narcissistic but necessary, not selfish but sacred. She understands that she cannot serve the world's healing if she participates in her own wounding, cannot contribute to the elevation of feminine consciousness if she allows her own consciousness to be diminished by those who fear her power. The dangerous power of the warrior queen's boundaries lies ultimately in their demonstration of what becomes possible when a woman fully inhabits her own life. Her boundaries create a sacred container within which her authentic self can flourish, a protected space where she can explore the full range of her potential without interference from those who would keep her small. In defending the territory of her authentic existence, she becomes a guardian, not only of her own sovereignty, but of the possibility of sovereignty for all women. Her boundaries serve as both protection and proclamation. This is what it looks like when a woman refuses to abandon herself, when she chooses her own truth over others' comfort, when she claims her rightful place as the queen of her own existence. And in this claiming, this fierce protection of her authentic self, she embodies the most dangerous power of all, the power to live completely as who she truly is, regardless of who that threatens, regardless of what systems must change to accommodate her truth, regardless of how many people must learn to relate to her as the sovereign being. She has always been beneath the masks and accommodations and self-betrayals of her unconscious past. She stands now as a living bridge between worlds, the world that was and the world that is emerging from the depths of collective transformation. The dangerous power she has discovered within herself is not hers alone to claim, but part of something far greater, the great rebalancing that must occur, the return of the sacred feminine to a world that has forgotten its own soul. Through her embodied authenticity, she becomes a catalyst for the remembering that stirs in the hearts of women everywhere, the remembering of who they were before the world taught them to be small. Her transformation ripples outward like circles. In still water, each wave carrying the frequency of her awakened consciousness to souls ready to receive its message. She does not seek to convince or convert, for she understands that awakening cannot be forced, only invited. Yet her very presence becomes an invitation, her authentic being a permission slip for others to explore the territories of their own unlived potential. In the grocery store, a stranger catches her eye and sees something there, a quality of presence, a depth of self-possession that stirs a long-dormant longing. The woman does not know why this encounter affects her so profoundly, why she finds herself thinking about it for days afterward, why she begins to question the compromises she has made in her own life. She does not realize that she has encountered the embodiment of her own possible future, the living proof that women can be both powerful and feminine, both strong and soft, both independent and loving. In her workplace, colleagues notice something different about the way she moves through her days. There is a quality of unshakable centeredness about her, a refusal to participate in the unconscious dramas that once consumed so much of everyone's energy. Her clarity becomes contagious. Other women begin to speak up in meetings where they once remained silent. They begin to value their own contributions, to trust their instincts, to refuse treatment that does not honor their worth. The ripple effect of her awakening extends far beyond her immediate circle, for consciousness recognizes consciousness across all boundaries of time and space. Women she will never meet feel the stirring of something ancient and powerful within their souls, the remembering of a time when feminine wisdom was revered, when women's ways of knowing were considered sacred, when the cycles and seasons of the feminine were honored as reflections of the earth's own rhythms. This remembering does not come as intellectual knowledge, but as cellular recognition, a knowing that rises from the deepest levels of being. It whispers to women in their dreams, calls to them through their bodies, speaks to them in the language of intuition and instinct that patriarchal culture has taught them to mistrust. The awakened woman becomes a tuning fork, vibrating at the frequency of authentic feminine power, and other women begin to resonate with that frequency, beginning their own journey back to themselves. She understands now that her individual healing was never separate from the collective healing that must occur. Every wound she has tended within herself contributes to the healing of the wounded feminine that lives within every woman. Every pattern she has broken within her own psyche weakens. That pattern's hold on the collective unconscious. Every time she chooses authenticity over adaptation, she makes it easier for other women to make the same choice. The dangerous power she embodies is not the power to dominate or control, but the power to heal and transform through the simple act of being fully herself. She carries within her cells the memory of a time before the splitting occurred, before feminine and masculine were set against each other instead of recognized as complementary forces within the whole. Her integration of these energies within herself becomes a model for the integration that must occur on a collective level. She has learned to wield both the sword and the chalice, to embody both fierce protection and nurturing receptivity, to be both the warrior who defends truth and the wise woman who holds space for healing. This integration threatens the old paradigm that insisted women must choose between power and love, between strength and gentleness, between independence and connection. She proves through her very being that these are false dichotomies, that true feminine power encompasses the full spectrum of human capacity. Her embodied wholeness gives other women permission to reclaim the aspects of themselves they have been taught to suppress or deny. The woman who has been conditioned to be endlessly accommodating sees in her the possibility of healthy boundaries. The woman who has been trained to doubt her own instincts witnesses her unwavering trust in inner knowing. The woman who has learned to make herself small observes her unapologetic claiming of space and presence. But the ripple effect of her awakening extends beyond individual women to the very structures and systems that have been built on feminine suppression and masculine domination. Her refusal to participate in dynamics that require her diminishment begins to expose the dysfunction inherent in those systems. Organizations that have relied on women's unpaid emotional labor find themselves forced to acknowledge and address this exploitation when women like her no longer provide it unconsciously. Families that have operated according to outdated gender roles discover that they must evolve or risk losing connection with the women who have outgrown their assigned positions. Romantic relationships based on unconscious power dynamics face the choice between transformation and dissolution when one partner awakens to her own worth and refuses to accept treatment that does not honor it. The sacred feminine that awakens through her being is not the romanticized, sanitized version that poses no threat to existing power structures. This is the full spectrum feminine, the fierce mother who protects her young, the wild woman who trusts her instincts, the wise crone who speaks uncomfortable truths, the creative force that brings new life into being. This feminine power cannot be controlled or domesticated, for it is connected to the same source that moves the tides, changes the seasons, and transforms seed into flower, into fruit, into seed again. Her awakening contributes to the return of cyclical thinking to a linear world, of intuitive knowing to a purely rational culture, of collaborative leadership to hierarchical domination. She brings the wisdom of the body to decisions that have been made purely from the mind, the guidance of feeling to situations that have been approached only through thinking, the intelligence of the heart to problems that logic alone cannot solve. The dangerous power of the awakened feminine lies in its capacity to transform through inclusion rather than exclusion, through integration rather than domination. She does not seek to destroy the masculine, but to call it back to its highest expression, to invite it into partnership rather than conquest, into protection rather than suppression, into the sacred marriage of complementary forces that creates new possibilities for human civilization. Through her own inner work, she becomes a bridge between the wounded masculine and the emerging feminine, demonstrating that healing can occur when both energies are honored and integrated. The men in her life who are ready for conscious relationship find in her presence an invitation to their own wholeness, their own integration of the feminine aspects they have been taught to deny within themselves. She carries within her being the future of human relating, partnerships based on mutual authenticity rather than unconscious projection, families that honor each member's individual growth rather than demanding conformity to restrictive roles, communities that value diverse ways of knowing rather than privileging only one form of intelligence. Her dangerous power manifests in her ability to hold space for the transformation that wants to emerge without forcing its timeline or controlling its expression. She understands that evolution cannot be rushed, that consciousness awakens according to its own mysterious rhythms, that her role is not to awaken the world but to remain awake within it and allow her awakened presence to serve as a catalyst for whatever is ready to unfold. The ripples of her transformation reach forward into future generations, for the children who grow up in the presence of her authentic being will carry different cellular memories than those raised by women who have abandoned themselves. They will learn that it is possible to be both loving and boundaried, both caring and self-caring, both devoted to others and faithful to oneself. The daughters who witness her embodied sovereignty will grow up expecting to be treated with respect, knowing their worth as birthright rather than something to be earned through self-sacrifice. The sons who observe her integrated power will develop different templates for relationship, understanding that true partnership requires the honoring of both feminine and masculine wisdom. She becomes an ancestor to futures not yet born, a bridge to possibilities not yet imagined, a guardian of potentials that exist in seed form within the collective unconscious. Her individual awakening plants seeds that will bloom in ways she cannot foresee, creating ripples of change that will continue long after her own lifetime ends. The great rebalancing that occurs through her embodied transformation is not just about the return of feminine power to a masculine-dominated world, but about the restoration of sacred wholeness to human consciousness itself. She carries within her being the memory of what we were meant to be, fully conscious beings capable of integrating all aspects of ourselves, fully awakened humans living in harmony with the natural rhythms of creation. Her dangerous power lies ultimately in her demonstration that another way is possible, that women can be fully authentic without being selfish, fully powerful without being destructive, fully sovereign without being disconnected. She proves through her daily existence that the integration of feminine and masculine energies within one being creates not conflict, but harmony, not weakness, but strength, not chaos, but a deeper order that serves life itself. And so the ripples continue to spread, carrying the frequency of her awakened consciousness to every corner of human experience, touching souls ready to remember their own dangerous power, their own capacity for transformation, their own essential nature as bridges between the world that has been and the world that is waiting to be born through their authentic being. The awakened feminine that lives within her is the awakened feminine that lives within all women, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be claimed, waiting to transform the world through the simple yet revolutionary act of being completely, authentically, dangerously alive. Through her courage to become who she truly is, she gives permission for the return of the sacred feminine to a world that desperately needs its healing wisdom, its integrative power, its fierce and tender love for all life. This is her gift too, the collective, not the answers to everyone's questions, but the living demonstration that the questions themselves can be trusted, that the journey into authentic being is worth whatever it costs, that the dangerous power every woman carries within her soul is not something to be feared, but something to be celebrated, embodied, and shared as a blessing with a world ready to remember what it means to be whole. At the summit of her journey into self-knowledge, she discovers the most liberating truth of all. There is no summit. There is no final destination where she can plant her flag and declare herself complete. No graduation ceremony from the school of becoming. No moment when she can stop growing and simply exist in the perfection of her achieved self. The dangerous power she has claimed reveals its ultimate secret. It lies not in any fixed achievement or static state of being, but in her willingness to remain forever in motion, forever open to the endless unfolding of who she is becoming. This revelation arrives not as disappointment, but as profound relief. The part of her that once sought the security of a finished identity, the comfort of knowing exactly who she was and would always be, dissolves into the greater truth of her essentially dynamic nature. She is not a noun, but a verb, not a destination, but a journey, not a fixed star, but a spiral galaxy forever expanding into new territories of consciousness and experience. The woman who has awakened to her dangerous power understands now that she is both the alchemist and the substance being transformed, both the artist and the masterpiece forever in progress, both the seeker and the sought, endlessly creating and recreating herself through the sacred work of conscious living. Each day offers new lead to be transformed into gold, new darkness to be integrated into light, new unconscious patterns to be illuminated by the ever-brightening flame of her awareness. She recognizes that her journey into authenticity was never about arriving somewhere, but about learning how to travel, how to move through the world with presence rather than performance, with curiosity rather than certainty, with trust in the process rather than attachment to outcomes. The dangerous power she embodies is the power of perpetual becoming, the willingness to release who she has been in service of who she is emerging to be. This eternal dance of becoming requires a courage different from the courage that initiated her awakening journey. In the beginning, she needed the courage to descend into her depths, to face her shadows, to challenge the conditioning that had shaped her false self. Now she needs the courage to remain open, to resist the temptation, to crystallize into a new fixed identity even as she grows more secure in her sense of self. She must learn to hold her emerging authenticity lightly, like water cupped in open palms, present and real, yet free to flow and change as the river of her being continues its journey toward unknown seas. The alchemical process she has mastered, within her own soul becomes a way of relating to all of existence. Every experience becomes raw material for transformation, every challenge an opportunity for deeper integration, every relationship a laboratory for practicing more authentic ways of being. She approaches her life with the curiosity of a scientist and the reverence of a mystic, understanding that she is both studying and participating in the greatest mystery of all, the endless creativity of consciousness exploring itself through form. Her dangerous power manifests now as an unshakable faith in the wisdom of the process itself. She has learned to trust the intelligence that guides her growth, even when she cannot understand its direction. She has witnessed enough transformations within her own being to know that what appears as breakdown is often breakthrough in disguise, that periods of confusion and uncertainty are often the fertile darkness from which new understanding emerges, that the death of old patterns creates space for the birth of new possibilities. This trust extends to the natural rhythms of expansion and contraction that characterize all living systems. She no longer fights against the seasons of her soul, the times when she needs to withdraw and go inward, the periods when she feels called to rest and integrate, the cycles when she must release what no longer serves in order to make room for what wants to emerge. She has learned to read the subtle signs of her own energy, to honor her need for solitude as much as her desire for connection, to trust that both her blooming and her dormancy are necessary aspects of her eternal becoming. The woman who dances. The eternal dance of becoming embodies a different relationship to time itself. She is no longer rushing toward some imagined future version of herself, nor clinging to past versions she has outgrown. She inhabits the present moment as the only place where transformation actually occurs, understanding that becoming happens not in some distant future, but in the sacred now of each conscious choice, each authentic response, each moment of alignment with her deepest truth. Yet she also holds a larger perspective on her journey, recognizing herself as part of a much greater unfolding, the evolution of consciousness itself through the countless individual awakenings that collectively transform the human experience. Her personal becoming contributes to the species-wide becoming that is occurring as more and more humans awaken to their true nature and begin to live from their authentic power rather than their conditioned patterns. The dangerous power of her eternal becoming lies in its threat to all systems based on control and predictability. She cannot be controlled because she cannot be fully known, not even by herself. She is always in the process of discovering new aspects of her nature, always exploring uncharted territories of her potential, always surprising herself with capacities she did not know she possessed. This makes her immune to the attempts of others to define her, limit her, or predict her responses based on who she used to be. Her family cannot trap her in the role of the good daughter because she continues to evolve beyond their ability to categorize her. Her friends cannot manipulate her through their knowledge of her past patterns because she is constantly transcending those patterns through conscious choice. Her romantic partners cannot control her through their understanding of her previous vulnerabilities because she is always healing and integrating new aspects of herself, always becoming more whole, more authentic, more aligned with her essential nature. This fluidity of identity disturbs those who prefer the safety of known quantities, who feel more comfortable relating to fixed personalities than to dynamic beings in constant evolution. But the woman who has embraced her eternal becoming understands that this discomfort is not her responsibility to manage. Her commitment is to her own authentic unfolding, not to others' comfort with who she used to be. She learns to hold space for the grief that accompanies each new level of becoming, the necessary mourning for aspects of herself that must die in order for new aspects to be born. Each transformation requires her to release attachment to previous versions of herself, to say goodbye to identities that once felt essential, to allow parts of her personality that no longer serve to compost into the rich soil from which her new growth emerges. This process of conscious death and rebirth becomes as natural to her as breathing. She understands that resistance to change is resistance to life itself, that clinging to who she has been prevents her from discovering who she is becoming. She develops the spiritual maturity to participate willingly in her own transformation, to say yes to the death that precedes every birth, to trust the intelligence of the process even when she cannot see where it is leading. The eternal dance of becoming reveals itself as the ultimate expression of creative power, the ability to continuously author her own existence, to write and rewrite the story of her life through conscious choices aligned with her deepest values and most authentic desires. She becomes the poet of her own becoming, crafting verses of experience that reflect her ever-deepening understanding of what it means to be fully alive, fully present, fully committed to the endless exploration of her own potential. Her dangerous power lies in her demonstration that human beings are not fixed entities, but dynamic processes, not predetermined patterns, but conscious creators of their own experience. Through her willingness to continue growing, changing, and evolving, she challenges every assumption about human nature based on limitation, stagnation, or inevitable decline. She proves that consciousness can continue expanding throughout an entire lifetime, that wisdom can deepen indefinitely, that the capacity for growth and transformation knows no bounds except those imposed by the belief in limitation itself. The woman who dances the eternal dance of becoming becomes a living example of human potential, not as some distant possibility to be achieved, but as a present reality to be continuously explored and expressed. She embodies the truth that enlightenment is not a destination, but a way of traveling, that wisdom is not a possession, but a practice, that authenticity is not a fixed state, but a dynamic process of alignment between inner truth and outer expression. Her relationships become laboratories for mutual becoming, spaces where two or more conscious beings support each other's evolution without trying to control its direction. She learns to love others not for who they are, but for who they are becoming, to see in each person the same infinite potential for growth and transformation that she has discovered within herself. Her love becomes a catalyst for others' awakening, not because she tries to change them, but because her own commitment to growth creates a field of possibility within which their own becoming can unfold. The dangerous power of her eternal becoming extends to her relationship with failure and success, triumph and defeat, gain and loss. She understands that these are temporary conditions within the larger context of her ongoing evolution, not final judgments on her worth or destiny. What appears as failure becomes compost for new growth. What seems like success becomes a platform from which to launch the next phase of her becoming. She holds both praise and criticism lightly, recognizing that external validation cannot define the value of her authentic journey toward wholeness. She develops what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox without collapsing into either extreme, to embrace both, and rather than insisting on either or. She can be both strong and vulnerable, both independent and interconnected, both grounded and transcendent, both human and divine. This integration of opposites within her being becomes a source of tremendous power and flexibility, allowing her to respond to life's complexity with nuanced understanding rather than rigid reaction patterns. The eternal dance of becoming requires her to develop a new kind of faith, not faith in any external deity or doctrine, but faith in the inherent wisdom of the creative process itself. She learns to trust that her life is unfolding according to a larger intelligence that she may not understand but can learn to align with. This faith allows her to navigate uncertainty with grace, to embrace the unknown as a source of possibility rather than threat, to move forward even when the path ahead is unclear. Her dangerous power culminates in her ability to live as an embodiment of possibility itself, a demonstration that human consciousness can continue expanding indefinitely, that personal transformation can continue throughout an entire lifetime, that the capacity for growth and evolution is perhaps the most essential characteristic of human nature. She becomes a beacon of hope for all who have forgotten their own potential for becoming, a living reminder that it is never too late to begin the journey toward authentic being. The woman who has awakened to her dangerous power and learned to dance the eternal dance of becoming discovers that her greatest service to the world is simply to continue being herself, fully, authentically, courageously exploring the infinite depths of her own nature and expressing what she finds there, without apology or compromise. In doing so, she gives permission for others to embark on their own journey of becoming, to trust their own process of transformation, to believe in their own capacity for endless growth and evolution. She understands now that the most dangerous woman in the world is not the one who has achieved some final state of perfection, but the one who remains forever committed to her own becoming, forever willing to grow beyond who she has been, forever open to the mystery of who she might yet become. This is the ultimate expression of feminine power, not the power to control or dominate, but the power to remain eternally creative, eternally generative, eternally alive to the endless possibilities that exist within the sacred dance of conscious becoming. And so she continues, moment by moment, choice by choice, breath by breath, to participate in the greatest adventure available to human consciousness. The journey of self-discovery and self-creation that has no end but offers infinite richness along the way. She dances the eternal dance of becoming with the fierce joy of one who knows herself to be both the dancer and the dance, both the question and the answer, both the seeker and the sought, forever exploring the vast territories of what it means to be magnificently, dangerously, authentically alive.